My son struck my chest 20 times with crumpled dollar bills in front of 60 wealthy guests. He told me that was exactly enough for a one-way bus ticket out of the state. So I sold the luxury estate he thought he owned for a single dollar while he was at work and let him lose absolutely everything. My name is Deandre. I am 70 years old. I spent my entire life breaking my back in the Atlanta freight yards to give my family a perfect life. I never expected that sacrifice to breed a monster. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heavy bass from the patio speakers rattled the glass sliding doors of my own home. I stood near the catering table holding a simple plastic cup of tap water. My daughter-in-law Audrey adjusted her expensive silk dress and glared directly at my faded work boots. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled for the affluent crowd gathering in my backyard. She despised my presence here. She leaned over and whispered sharply into my son Jordan's ear. Jordan nodded slowly. His face hardened into a mask of pure arrogance. He marched across the mahogany deck toward me with purposeful heavy steps. The loud conversations around us died down instantly. The wealthy investors and corporate partners turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Jordan reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers and pulled out a thick wad of single-dollar bills. He did not say a word to greet me. He did not show an ounce of the respect I had instilled in him since he was a child. He raised his hand and struck my chest with a single bill. The paper fluttered down to the wet stone patio. He struck me again. 2, 3, 4. The music abruptly stopped. 60 guests watched the spectacle in complete silence. The only sound was the sharp smack of paper hitting my shirt. Jordan continued striking my chest with the bills, counting out loud with every humiliating slap. He hit my chest exactly 20 times. 20 individual strikes of public degradation meant to break my spirit. $20, Jordan announced. His voice echoed across the silent yard with absolute malice. That is exactly what a one-way bus ticket out of this state costs. Pack your bags right now. I filed the deed transfer this morning. I am the legal owner of this estate. You are officially trespassing at my corporate networking event. Audrey smiled triumphantly from the catering table. She took a slow, arrogant sip of her expensive champagne. We are converting your dusty bedroom into a home gym, Audrey declared loudly, so her rich friends could hear every word. The movers are throwing your old boxes into the alley right now. They tossed out those ridiculous wooden carvings you waste your time making. I suggest you grab your pathetic belongings before the garbage trucks arrive tomorrow morning. We refuse to let your trash ruin our aesthetic. You have lived off my success for too long, Jordan added, completely ignoring the fact that I bought the house. You walk around my guests looking like a homeless beggar. You embarrass me. Take your $20 and get out of my sight before I call the police and have you physically removed for trespassing. I stood completely still. I looked at the crowd of people wearing designer watches and tailored suits. Some of them chuckled behind their hands, amused by the humiliation of an old man. Some simply looked away, complicit in their silence. Nobody stepped forward to intervene. Jordan crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for me to scream or cry. He wanted a dramatic reaction to justify his cruelty. He wanted me to look like a crazy, senile old man ruining his perfect suburban image. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I looked down at the 20 crumpled bills resting on the toes of my boots. Then I looked back at the son I had raised. I turned my back and walked out of the yard. I ignored the cruel laughter of his friends trailing behind me. I walked down the long concrete driveway with a heavy heart but a completely clear mind. I did not remind Jordan of the 40 years I spent hauling heavy steel at the Atlanta freight yards. I worked grueling double shifts in the unforgiving southern heat to pay for his Ivy League education in cash. I did not mention the nights his mother Yvonne and I skipped dinner so he could afford his expensive law school textbooks. We shielded him from the harsh reality of poverty because we loved him. I remembered the day Yvonne passed away. Jordan did not even shed a tear at her funeral. He simply asked when the life insurance policy would clear. I ignored the red flags back then. I chose to see the boy I raised instead of the cold, calculating lawyer he had become. I thought my relentless financial support would give him the freedom to become an honorable man. Instead, my protection had completely corrupted him. It gave him the unearned arrogance to treat human beings like disposable objects. He mistook my quiet humility for weakness. I climbed into my old Ford truck parked on the street. My hands gripped the worn steering wheel tightly. I needed a place to sleep tonight while I formulated my response to this betrayal. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking application to secure a cheap hotel room. A cold, suffocating panic instantly gripped my chest. My primary retirement account balance read 0. I refreshed the screen thinking it was a technical error. My emergency savings account also read zero. Jordan had not just stolen the deed to the estate using his legal background. He had completely wiped out my life savings. Every single penny I had earned over 4 decades of backbreaking labor was gone. He had left me utterly destitute on the street. The betrayal burned in my veins, but I refused to let it break me. I had navigated corrupt union bosses and ruthless freight managers for decades. Jordan thought he was a mastermind, but he was playing a game I had mastered before he was even born. I started the engine, I threw the heavy truck into gear, and pressed my foot on the gas pedal. I drove straight toward the downtown financial district. My silence was not surrender. It was the quiet calculation of a man about to shift the tectonic plates of his family's reality. Jordan had made the biggest mistake of his life, and I was going to correct it. I stood in the pouring rain while my own son slapped 20 crumpled dollar bills against my chest. He told his wealthy friends it was exactly enough to buy a one-way bus ticket out of his life. He thought he had legally stolen my multi-million-dollar estate and wiped out my life savings. He did not realize I had spent 40 years running the toughest freight union in Atlanta. While he was busy popping champagne to celebrate my eviction, I quietly sold his pristine mansion to the city for $1 and let him lose absolutely everything. My name is Deandre, I am 70 years old, and I am about to teach you why you should never mistake a father's silence for weakness. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heavy bass from the patio speakers rattled the glass sliding doors of my own home. I stood near the catering table holding a simple plastic cup of tap water. My daughter-in-law Audrey adjusted her expensive silk dress and glared directly at my faded leather work boots. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled for the affluent crowd gathering in my backyard. She despised my presence here. She leaned over and whispered sharply into my son Jordan's ear. Jordan nodded slowly. His face hardened into a mask of pure arrogance. He marched across the mahogany deck toward me with purposeful heavy steps. The loud conversations around us died down instantly. The wealthy investors and corporate partners turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Jordan reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers and pulled out a thick wad of single-dollar bills. He did not say a word to greet me. He did not show an ounce of the respect I had instilled in him since he was a child. He raised his hand and struck my chest with a single bill. The paper fluttered down to the wet stone patio. He struck me again. 2, 3, 4. The music abruptly stopped. 60 guests watched the spectacle in complete silence. The only sound was the sharp smack of paper hitting my shirt. Jordan continued striking my chest with the bills, counting out loud with every humiliating slap. He hit my chest exactly 20 times. 20 individual strikes of public degradation meant to break my spirit. $20, Jordan announced. His voice echoed across the silent yard with absolute malice. That is exactly what a one-way bus ticket out of this state costs. Pack your bags right now. I filed the deed transfer this morning. I am the legal owner of this estate. You are officially trespassing at my corporate networking event. Audrey smiled triumphantly from the catering table. She took a slow, arrogant sip of her expensive champagne. We are converting your dusty bedroom into a home gym, Audrey declared loudly, so her rich friends could hear every word. The movers are throwing your old boxes into the alley right now. They tossed out those ridiculous wooden carvings you waste your time making. I suggest you grab your pathetic belongings before the garbage trucks arrive tomorrow morning. We refuse to let your trash ruin our aesthetic. You have lived off my success for too long, Jordan added, completely ignoring the fact that I bought the house. You walk around my guests looking like a homeless beggar. You embarrass me. Take your $20 and get out of my sight before I call the police and have you physically removed for trespassing. I stood completely still. I looked at the crowd of people wearing designer watches and tailored suits. Some of them chuckled behind their hands, amused by the humiliation of an old man. Some simply looked away, complicit in their silence. Nobody stepped forward to intervene. Jordan crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for me to scream or cry. He wanted a dramatic reaction to justify his cruelty. He wanted me to look like a crazy, senile old man ruining his perfect suburban image. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I looked down at the 20 crumpled bills resting on the toes of my boots. Then I looked back at the son I had raised. I turned my back and walked out of the yard. I ignored the cruel laughter of his friends trailing behind me. I walked down the long concrete driveway with a heavy heart, but a completely clear mind. I did not remind Jordan of the 40 years I spent hauling heavy steel at the Atlanta freight yards. I worked grueling double shifts in the unforgiving southern heat to pay for his Ivy League law school education in cash. I did not mention the nights his mother and I skipped dinner so he could afford his expensive textbooks. We shielded him from the harsh reality of poverty because we loved him. I chose to see the boy I raised instead of the cold, calculating corporate lawyer he had become. I thought my relentless financial support would give him the freedom to become an honorable man. Instead, my protection had completely corrupted him. It gave him the unearned arrogance to treat human beings like disposable objects. He mistook my quiet humility for weakness. I climbed into my old Ford truck parked on the street. My hands gripped the worn steering wheel tightly. I needed a place to sleep tonight while I formulated my response to this brutal betrayal. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking application to secure a cheap hotel room on the edge of town. A cold, suffocating panic instantly gripped my chest. My primary retirement account balance read 0. I refreshed the screen thinking it was a technical error. My emergency savings account also read 0. Jordan had not just stolen the deed to the estate using his legal background. He had completely wiped out my life savings. Every single penny I had earned over 4 decades of backbreaking labor was gone. He had left me utterly destitute on the street. The betrayal burned in my veins, but I refused to let it break me. I had navigated corrupt union bosses and ruthless freight managers for decades. Jordan thought he was an untouchable mastermind, but he was playing a game I had mastered before he was even born. I started the engine. I threw the heavy truck into gear and pressed my foot firmly on the gas pedal. I drove straight toward the downtown Atlanta financial district. My silence was not surrender. It was the quiet calculation of a man about to shift the tectonic plates of his family's reality. Jordan had made the biggest mistake of his life, and I was going to violently correct it. I sprinted out of Stephen Reed's law firm with the heavy pounding steps of a man half my age. Stephen was right behind me, his dress shoes slapping against the wet Atlanta pavement. We did not have time to wait for traffic lights or crosswalk signals. We dodged angry pedestrians and blaring taxicabs, crossing 2 busy downtown blocks in less than 3 minutes. We burst through the heavy glass doors of the central bank's main branch. I did not wait in the velvet-roped lobby line. I marched directly past the bewildered security guard and pushed open the solid oak door of the branch manager's private office. The manager, a young man in a sharp custom suit, looked up from his dual monitors with instant irritation. He stood up, smoothing his silk tie, completely unaccustomed to people violating his corporate sanctuary. "Excuse me, you cannot just barge in here," he demanded, reaching for his desk phone to summon security. "Cancel the international wire transfer exiting the account of Deandre Thompson," I ordered. I slammed my driver's license onto his pristine glass desk. "That transaction is based on a forged power of attorney. It is active criminal fraud." The manager adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and glanced at his screen. "Sir, I see the transfer. It was fully authorized by your son, Jordan Thompson. He holds a verified legal power of attorney on file. I cannot freeze a high-yield transaction based on a verbal accusation. You need a court injunction. That wire will clear the International Clearinghouse in exactly 60 seconds. I stepped closer to his desk, completely ignoring the flashing red light on his telephone. He was preparing to call the police to have me escorted out. He saw a 70-year-old black man in a faded denim jacket and scuffed work boots, assuming I was just another helpless victim of a family financial dispute. He believed his corporate policies shielded him from the consequences of facilitating my ruin. He was severely mistaken. I leaned over his desk, placing both of my large, calloused hands firmly on the polished wood. I closed the physical distance between us until he was forced to lean back in his expensive ergonomic chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or curse. I spoke with the heavy, crushing authority of a man who held the absolute power to destroy his entire livelihood. "You manage this local branch," I stated, locking my eyes onto his terrified gaze. "But you also hold the primary commercial accounts for the Atlanta Freight Union. I ran that specific union for 20 consecutive years. I personally negotiated the contract that moved our $50 million pension fund into your specific bank branch. If you do not freeze that wire transfer in the next 10 seconds, I will pull my cell phone out of my pocket. I will call the current union president, a man who considers me a second father. I will have the entire $50 million pension fund withdrawn from your branch by the end of the business day." The manager swallowed hard. A thick bead of sweat formed on his forehead and rolled down his temple. His arrogant corporate posture collapsed instantly. He looked at my worn boots, then up at my unyielding eyes, and he realized with absolute certainty that I was not bluffing. Losing a $50 million account would not just result in his immediate termination. It would permanently blacklist him from the entire financial sector. He would never work in banking again. 10 seconds, I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. 9, 8, 7. The manager's hands began to shake violently. He dropped the telephone receiver. His fingers flew across his computer keyboard with desperate speed. 6, 5. I continued counting, letting the absolute weight of my ultimatum crush his corporate loyalty. He was sweating through his expensive suit. He typed his override credentials, his breath hitching in his throat. He clicked through multiple security prompts, overriding the automated clearinghouse protocols just seconds before the digital gate closed. The heavy silence in the office was broken only by his frantic, terrified typing. My quiet dominance in that office did not come from thin air. It was forged through decades of brutal, cutthroat negotiations with ruthless freight executives who tried to exploit my workers. During my time as the union boss, I learned exactly how the men in these high-rise buildings operated. They did not respond to emotion tears or moral pleas for justice. They only responded to leverage. They only understood the language of catastrophic financial loss. I had spent 40 years sitting across the table from men exactly like this branch manager, identifying their ultimate pressure points and squeezing until they capitulated. Jordan thought he learned how to be ruthless by attending an expensive law school. He merely adopted the aesthetic of power. I was the one who actually wrote the textbook on leverage. I knew how to completely dismantle a man's career with a single phone call, and I was fully prepared to do it to protect the legacy I had built from the ground up. I had bled for that union pension fund, fighting tooth and nail against corporate greed to ensure my men could retire with dignity. I would gladly weaponize that same fund to stop my own son from stealing my survival. "The wire is officially frozen," the manager whispered. His voice was hoarse, completely devoid of its previous arrogance. He turned his monitor around to show Stephen the confirmation screen. "The funds are locked in a secure escrow account pending a full internal fraud investigation. The money will not leave this building." I stepped back from his desk, restoring his personal space. "Thank you for your prompt customer service," I said flatly. My phone instantly began to ring in my jacket pocket. The screen flashed Jordan's name. He had been monitoring the offshore account and realized the massive deposit was just rejected. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone so Stephen could hear every word. "What did you do?" Jordan screamed through the speaker. The loud party music from his backyard networking event was entirely gone. "Audrey's offshore account just bounced the deposit. My corporate credit cards are declining at the catering company. Unlock the bank accounts right now." "You senile old fool. You hit me 20 times with single-dollar bills," I replied with chilling calm. "You should have saved that cash, Jordan. You are going to need it to buy your own groceries tonight." Jordan let out a guttural sound of pure rage. "Listen to me very carefully," he threatened, his voice dripping with vicious panic. "I have a private board-certified psychiatrist standing by at the estate right now. If you do not authorize the release of those funds in the next 10 minutes, I am sending an ambulance to have you involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward. I will lock you in a padded room for the rest of your miserable life." I kept my foot pressed firmly on the gas pedal all the way back to my estate. I pulled my battered Ford truck up the long, curving driveway and immediately slammed on the brakes. 2 massive commercial moving trucks were parked directly on my pristine front lawn, tearing up the green grass I had meticulously maintained for years. Jordan stood near the grand entrance, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers and a severe-looking man in a stark white medical coat. Jordan pointed a rigid finger directly at my windshield the moment I cut the engine. He did not look like a son greeting his father. He looked like an executioner ready to deliver a final devastating blow. I stepped out of the truck with Stephen right behind me. Jordan immediately raised his voice, adopting a tone of exaggerated theatrical panic designed entirely for the police officers to hear. "Officers, that is the man," Jordan declared, keeping a safe distance, as if I were a feral, unpredictable animal. "My father is suffering from severe violent dementia. He is completely untethered from reality and poses an imminent physical threat to himself and my entire family. This is Dr. Aris, a board-certified psychiatrist. He has evaluated my father's extensive medical history and signed an emergency order for involuntary psychiatric commitment. Grab him before he becomes combative." I looked at the doctor, a man whose eyes shifted nervously away from mine. How is a paid mercenary holding a clipboard meant to erase my freedom forever? The 2 police officers unclipped the heavy restraints from their belts and began walking cautiously toward me. They were acting on official medical documentation and the seemingly credible word of an affluent corporate lawyer.
I stood my ground, my hands resting calmly at my sides. Stephen stepped out from behind the tailgate of my truck and intercepted the officers halfway across the lawn. He held up a thick certified legal folder bearing the heavy embossed seal of the City of Atlanta.
Officers, I am Stephen Reed, legal counsel for Deandre Thompson. Stephen announced with absolute booming authority. My client is in perfect mental health. The man attempting to commit him, his son, Jordan Thompson, is currently the subject of an active fraud investigation by the central bank. Jordan let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He crossed his arms and looked at Stephen with utter disdain. That is a pathetic lie, Jordan scoffed, glaring at us. I am the sole legal owner of this estate.
I hold the verified deed. I signed a multi-million-dollar commercial contract this morning to sell this exact property to Carmine Holdings. This man is a trespassing lunatic. Stephen did not argue. He simply opened the folder and handed the primary document directly to the senior police officer. That is impossible, Stephen stated smoothly. You could not have sold this property this morning, Jordan. The estate is registered to an irrevocable blind trust. My client sold this entire property to the Atlanta Affordable Housing Authority precisely 2 hours ago. This land belongs to the municipal government. You just signed a commercial contract to sell a house you do not own to one of the most dangerous commercial developers in the state. The officer scanned the notarized city transfer document and then looked up at Jordan. The smug, arrogant smirk completely vanished from Jordan's face.
All the color drained from his cheeks as the catastrophic reality of his massive commercial fraud crashed down on him. The officer turned his attention to the nervous psychiatrist holding the clipboard. The officer demanded to see the medical evaluation proving my supposed dementia. Dr. Aris began to stammer, unable to provide a single date of examination or a verifiable medical record. Stephen informed the officers that the doctor had accepted a massive cash bribe to forge the commitment order.
The police immediately handcuffed the corrupt psychiatrist for filing a fraudulent medical directive and actively obstructing justice. Jordan watched his hired gun get shoved into the back of a police cruiser, his entire master plan crumbling before his eyes.
His jaw trembled in absolute terror. Jordan had spent his entire adult life relying exclusively on his expensive law license to intimidate working-class people. It was a disgusting, deeply ingrained habit he developed in his early 20s. He wanted desperately to distance himself from his blue-collar roots in the grime of the Atlanta freight yards where I had raised him. He believed a crisp suit and legal jargon made him invincible against anyone without a college degree. He viewed the law not as an instrument of justice, but as a blunt weapon to crush anyone beneath his tax bracket. He thought he could wave a forged piece of paper and simply erase an old man from society without facing a single consequence. He never bothered to understand the ironclad legal mechanisms I had put in place to protect the wealth I built with my bare hands. His arrogance blinded him to the very laws he claimed to master, leaving him entirely exposed. Jordan fell to his knees on the damp grass. His tailored trousers soaked up the mud, but he was too paralyzed by fear to care. A fleet of sleek black SUVs suddenly turned into the driveway, blocking the main exit completely. 4 heavily armed private security contractors stepped out, followed by Carmine, the ruthless commercial developer Jordan had just defrauded. Carmine marched across the lawn, completely ignoring the remaining police officers who were busy securing the psychiatrist. He stopped directly in front of Jordan and looked down with dead, unforgiving eyes. You signed a binding commercial contract. Jordan Carmine growled, his voice a low, gravelly threat that cut through the afternoon breeze. You took a massive cash advance from my firm, and now I find out you sold me city-owned property. I want my land or I want my money back by the end of the week, plus 50% interest for the insult. Jordan was weeping openly now. He looked up at Carmine, his hands shaking violently as he begged for his life. I will get your money, Jordan promised, his voice cracking with desperate, unhinged panic. I know how to access the $50 million Atlanta Freight Union pension fund. My father was the boss. I have his old master administrative passwords. Give me 48 hours and I will wire you the entire balance. Carmine stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once before turning away. He gave Jordan exactly 2 days to deliver. Stephen and I left the chaotic scene at the estate and immediately relocated to a secure hotel suite in the heart of downtown Atlanta. We needed a fortified operational base where Jordan could not track us or send another bribed official to harass me. Stephen set up his heavy encrypted laptop on the glass dining table and began establishing digital perimeters around my remaining assets. The room was silent except for the rapid clicking of his keyboard. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, watching the city lights flicker through the floor-to-ceiling windows. We had successfully blocked the fraudulent sale of my home and paralyzed the offshore wire transfer, but a cornered animal is always the most dangerous. Jordan was absolutely desperate. Carmine had given him exactly 48 hours to deliver nearly $1 million to cover the botched real estate deal. I knew my son was currently scrambling through every illegal avenue available to him to find that cash.
Less than an hour after we arrived, a sharp, piercing alarm echoed from Stephen's computer speakers. A red notification box flashed aggressively across the center of his monitor. Stephen leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, as he rapidly traced the source of the sudden digital intrusion. "Deandre, we have another massive security breach," Stephen announced, his voice tight with urgency. "Jordan is not stopping.
He just bypassed a secondary verification protocol and is currently attempting to liquidate a hidden life insurance policy attached to your primary estate file."
I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter with a heavy thud. I did not possess an active life insurance policy. I had cashed out my personal policies years ago to finalize the purchase of the estate and ensure my union retirement was fully liquid. I walked over to the glass table and stared down at the glowing monitor. "Bring up the origination documents right now," I commanded. Stephen's fingers flew across the keys,
bypassing the insurance firm's basic privacy wall using his federal legal credentials. The detailed policy parameters materialized on the screen. My blood turned to absolute ice. The life insurance policy did not belong to me. It belonged to my late wife, Yvonne. It was a comprehensive secondary policy she had purchased independently decades ago to ensure I would be taken care of if she passed away unexpectedly. The payout value was exactly $250,000.
But the name listed under the primary beneficiary status was not mine. It read Audrey Thompson. "How is this remotely possible?" I demanded, pointing at my daughter-in-law's name glaring back at me from the screen. Yvonne designated me as the sole beneficiary of her entire estate. I saw the original policy with my own two eyes 30 years ago. Stephen rapidly cross-referenced the digital timestamps. The beneficiary was legally altered and completely redirected exactly 5 years ago, Stephen explained, tracing the digital signature and the corresponding IP addresses. Jordan submitted a formal change of beneficiary request, precisely 2 weeks after Yvonne passed away. He used his legal standing as your family attorney to process the transfer without triggering an automatic verification call to your home phone. He deliberately bypassed the secondary authorization checks by claiming you were medically unfit to sign during your bereavement period. I felt a violent surge of pure,
unadulterated rage burn through my chest. They had not just stolen from me. They had reached into the grave to rob a dead woman. Jordan and Audrey were currently trying to cash out the final piece of my wife's legacy to pay off a ruthless commercial developer to save their own worthless skins. "Pull the original scanned paperwork from the insurance database immediately," I ordered Stephen. "I need to see exactly how he bypassed the mandatory notarization requirements. Jordan is arrogant,
but he is incredibly careful with paper trails. He could not have authorized this massive transfer without a verified state official stamping the document." Stephen nodded and initiated a deep dive into the insurance company's archival servers to retrieve the physical scan of the fraudulent contract. The crushing weight of the past pressed down heavily on my shoulders. I remembered the agonizing weeks following Yvonne's sudden death. I was completely consumed by a blinding, suffocating grief. After 40 years of marriage, losing her tore my world into unrecognizable pieces. I could barely force myself out of bed, let alone manage complex financial paperwork or navigate the bureaucratic maze of probate court. Jordan stepped in during that vulnerable time. He offered to handle all the funeral arrangements and estate administrative duties. He told me to focus entirely on healing while he and Audrey managed the chaotic legal paperwork. I trusted my son implicitly. I handed him the keys to our filing cabinets and granted him temporary access to our sensitive accounts, believing he was acting out of deep familial love and respect for his mother. I believed he wanted to spare me any further agony. I now realized they had actively weaponized my profound mourning. While I was weeping over my wife's casket, Jordan and Audrey were sitting in my home office maliciously siphoning off her hidden assets to fund their luxurious, superficial lifestyle. Stephen finally bypassed the archive wall and pulled the high-resolution scan of the forged change of beneficiary document onto the main screen. I leaned over the laptop, scrutinizing the bottom right corner of the page. The state notary seal was stamped perfectly over a messy, illegible signature. I instantly recognized the printed name beneath the official stamp. It belonged to Travis Collins. I was a highly corrupt local official who used to handle low-level bureaucratic bribes around the freight yards before I drove him out of my district years ago. Jordan had obviously paid Travis a substantial cash bribe to backdate and blindly authorize the stolen policy. I memorized the notary stamp, silently vowing to hunt Travis down and force him to confess to his part in this disgusting conspiracy. But before I could instruct Stephen to locate the corrupt official's current address, a massive blaring siren erupted from Stephen's secondary monitor. The entire screen flashed a brilliant, blinding red. Stephen gasped, his hands freezing over the keyboard in absolute shock. "Deandre, we have a catastrophic emergency," Stephen shouted, his voice cracking with genuine panic. Jordan realized the life insurance payout is pending a mandatory 30-day processing hold. He is not waiting around for that cash to clear. He just initiated a highly aggressive, hostile cyber attack directly onto the Atlanta Freight Union's main administrative servers. He is trying to digitally bypass their firewalls to steal the entire $50 million pension fund right now. Stephen spun his laptop around so I could see the cascading lines of code tearing through the digital security barrier. The screen bathed his terrified face in a harsh green light. Jordan was not just knocking on the front door of the Atlanta Freight Union server. He was actively dismantling the secondary firewalls using highly classified administrative backdoors. He knew exactly where the vulnerabilities were located because he had personally installed them. 5 years ago, I had hired my own son as an independent legal consultant to upgrade the union digital compliance infrastructure. I paid his exorbitant corporate rates out of my own pocket to give his struggling firm a legitimate boost. He used that generous opportunity to secretly embed malicious access points into the very system designed to protect my workers. He was currently exploiting the trust I had explicitly handed to him, attempting to drain $50 million in hard-earned pension funds just to save himself from Carmine's wrath. Stephen reached for his cell phone with trembling hands, insisting we had to call the federal authorities immediately to lock down the entire network before Jordan breached the final vault. I slammed my hand down on top of his phone, pinning it flat against the glass table. I stared at the scrolling code with a cold, absolute certainty. "Do not call the police," I commanded. "If we involve the federal authorities now, they will freeze the entire pension fund for years, pending a bureaucratic investigation. My men will not be able to buy their groceries or pay their mortgages. I am not letting my son destroy thousands of innocent families. I will handle this myself." I pulled my burner phone from my jacket and dialed a private number I had memorized long ago. The line rang barely twice before a sharp alert voice answered. It was Deshaun, the current director of cybersecurity for the freight union. I had discovered Deshaun 20 years ago, working as a teenage dispatcher on the loading docks, recognizing his brilliant mind for logistics and paying for his computer science degree entirely out of my own pocket. I knew he was currently monitoring the active breach from his secure terminal. "Deandre," Deshaun said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We have a massive hostile intrusion. Someone is utilizing legacy administrative keys to tear through the outer perimeter. I am preparing to sever the main connection nodes. Do not sever the connection." I instructed calmly. "The intruder is Jordan. He is desperate and attempting to liquidate the pension accounts. If you block him now, he will just pivot and attack the regional banking affiliates directly. We need to catch him in a box he cannot escape. I need you to initiate the ghost protocol." Deshaun paused for only a fraction of a second before his fingers began hammering his mechanical keyboard. "You want me to open the secondary firewall?" Deshaun asked, confirming the dangerous strategy. "Yes," I replied. "I want you to drop the digital gates and roll out the red carpet. Guide him directly into the isolated decoy server. Let him think he has successfully breached the main financial vault." Deshaun executed the commands with ruthless efficiency. Stephen watched in absolute disbelief as the aggressive red alerts on his monitor suddenly turned into solid green confirmation bars. Jordan was rushing blindly through the digital corridors, completely unaware that he was being herded like cattle. He bypassed the final security prompt and initiated a massive data extraction, believing he was downloading the routing numbers and access codes for the $50 million pension fund. He was actually downloading a highly classified radioactive data packet engineered specifically by Deshaun to combat corporate espionage. The decoy files contained zero actual financial value. Instead, they were rigged to silently broadcast his exact coordinates directly to the Department of Homeland Security the moment the files hit his local hard drive. Jordan was greedily swallowing a poisoned hook. Stephen stared at the screen, wiping sweat from his brow. "You knew he still had those administrative access keys," Stephen murmured. Why did you never revoke his legacy clearance? I looked out the hotel window at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I did revoke his actual clearance, I explained quietly. 10 years ago, Jordan represented a union worker in a simple compensation dispute. I watched my son intentionally prolong the settlement process just to inflate his own billable hours, bleeding a struggling family dry for his own profit. I saw the pure, unadulterated greed festering in his eyes. I knew right then that his moral compass was fundamentally broken. The very next morning, I secretly completely restructured the union security framework. I changed every genuine master password and isolated his original access keys in a dead-end sandbox. I left his old administrative credentials active simply as a silent tripwire. I spent the last decade praying to God that he would never actually be arrogant enough to use them against his own people. My son had finally proven my darkest fears completely correct. The laptop speakers emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. Deshaun confirmed the payload was successfully delivered. Jordan had completely downloaded the rigged data packet. The tracking software instantly activated, triggering an automated, irreversible alert directly to the Federal Cybercrime Division in Atlanta. Federal agents were already dispatching tactical units to Jordan's exact IP address. His life as an elite corporate attorney was officially over. I thanked Deshaun and ended the call, feeling the heavy, sorrowful weight of a father sending his own son to prison. Before Stephen could close the encrypted monitoring application, my burner phone buzzed violently on the glass table. An incoming text message flashed across the screen from an unregistered prepaid number. I opened the message and read the frantic calculating words. It was from Audrey. She had obviously recognized the digital tracking alert on Jordan's computer and realized the FBI was minutes away from raiding their location. She was not reaching out to apologize or beg for her husband's salvation. Deandre, the message read, "Jordan is finished. I know about the frozen $800,000 in the escrow account." I copied his entire hard drive, including the evidence of his offshore embezzlement and the fake deed transfers. Meet me at the Buckhead Coffee Lounge in exactly 20 minutes. Give me the frozen cash and grant me full legal immunity, and I will hand you the evidence to bury your son forever. If you refuse, I will destroy the drives and disappear. I left Stephen at this hotel and drove my rusty truck straight into the heart of Buckhead. The upscale coffee lounge was a glass and steel monument to overpriced vanity. It was exactly the kind of place Audrey considered her natural habitat. I walked through the sliding double doors, completely ignoring the judgmental stares of the young corporate professionals tapping on their expensive laptops. I spotted her immediately sitting in a velvet booth at the far back of the room. She wore a pair of oversized designer sunglasses indoors, a pathetic attempt to hide the raw panic clawing at her perfectly contoured face. I sat down across from her, without ordering a drink or removing my jacket. Audrey did not waste a single second with polite pleasantries. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. She slid it across the marble table, keeping her manicured fingertips pressed firmly on top of the metal casing. "Jordan is currently locked in his home office, frantically trying to wipe his servers," Audrey whispered rapidly. Her voice was sharp and laced with desperate adrenaline. "He does not realize I already cloned the master directory. Every single forged document, the offshore routing numbers, the fake commercial contracts, everything is right here. I will hand it over to you right now. In exchange, you will call the bank manager, unfreeze the $800,000 in the escrow account, and route it directly to my personal offshore portfolio. You will also sign a legally binding non-disclosure agreement granting me absolute immunity from this entire disaster." I looked at the small metal drive trapped under her manicured fingertips. "You really think you are in a position to negotiate?" I asked quietly, keeping my gaze locked onto hers. Jordan just triggered a massive federal cybercrime alert on the union's servers. The FBI is literally knocking on your front door as we speak. Audrey let out a bitter, venomous laugh. "You think I care about Jordan going to federal prison?" she spat, leaning closer across the marble table to ensure no one else heard her. "I hope they lock him under the jail and throw away the key. I have spent the last 3 hours frantically digging through his encrypted personal folders while he was busy destroying his hard drives. He is not just stealing from you, Deandre. He is stealing from me. Jordan has a secret second family living in a luxury condo in Savannah. Hanya has been systematically funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars out of our joint business accounts to maintain a completely parallel double life for the past 4 years. He bought another woman a house while telling me we could not afford to expand my wellness spa. I am taking this frozen money and I am boarding a direct flight to Paris tonight. You get the hard evidence to bury your traitor of a son forever, and I get the financial exit I deserve. It is a clean trade. I reached out and smoothly pulled the USB drive from beneath her fingers. My hands were calloused and heavy from decades of manual labor moving with a practiced speed she could not counter. I dropped the silver drive into my denim jacket pocket and leaned back against the plush velvet booth. I will not authorize the release of a single penny from that escrow account, I stated with absolute clarity. That money belongs to the estate you both attempted to steal this morning. You do not get a golden parachute for turning against your husband at the 11th hour just because you discovered his infidelity. You are a willing, eager accomplice to elder abuse, forgery, and grand larceny. You smiled and drank champagne while he hit me with dollar bills in your backyard. You do not get to walk away clean from the wreckage you helped create. Audrey's jaw dropped in absolute shock. Her fake composure shattered completely. You cannot just take the drive, she hissed, her voice rising dangerously loud in the quiet cafe. I will report you to the police for theft. I will tell them you orchestrated this entire financial collapse to ruin us. I will destroy your reputation in this city. I stared at her, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound disgust. Audrey grew up in a superficial, wealth-obsessed suburban family that measured a person's worth entirely by the brand of their car and the square footage of their home. Her parents went completely bankrupt trying to maintain a lavish country club facade, teaching her that appearances mattered more than integrity. I always knew she only married Jordan to exploit my powerful freight union connections and climb the Atlantic social ladder. She openly despised my blue-collar roots and the calluses on my hands, yet she eagerly built her lavish lifestyle on the foundation of my hard labor. She viewed my family as nothing more than a stepping stone to fund her elitist vanity projects. She had never worked an honest day in her entire life, relying entirely on manipulation and intense entitlement to survive.
She assumed I would bend to her threats just to avoid a public scandal, grossly underestimating my resolve. Now the hollow empire she married into was actively burning to the ground, and she was desperately grasping for a lifeline that I absolutely refused to throw her.
You are not going to Paris, Audrey, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. You opened that offshore account in the Cayman Islands using your maiden name, but you utilized a fraudulent tax identification number to deliberately bypass the international reporting protocols. My attorney, Stephen, tracked the digital footprint an hour ago. Do you know what the mandatory penalty is for international tax evasion and wire fraud?
The federal government will personally hold you liable for the entire missing sum. Furthermore, your passport was automatically flagged the moment the bank froze the transfer for a criminal investigation. If you try to board an international flight tonight, customs agents will arrest you directly at the departure gate. Audrey turned completely pale. Her designer sunglasses slipped down the bridge of her nose as the terrifying, inescapable reality of her situation crushed her.
She grabbed her handbag, scrambled out of the velvet booth, and sprinted out of the coffee shop in a state of absolute, unadulterated panic. I finished my glass of water and walked back to my truck. I finally had the hard evidence to permanently lock Jordan away, but the victory felt hollow. I drove back to the downtown hotel, exhausted from the relentless battle. I stepped off the elevator on my floor and walked down the quiet carpeted hallway. I stopped dead in my tracks.
The heavy wooden door to my secure suite was splintered and kicked wide open. The metal lock hung uselessly from the broken frame. I stepped cautiously inside and found Stephen pinned roughly against the wall. 3 massive, heavily armed enforcers working for Carmine stood in the center of the room waiting for me. The heavy wooden door to my secure hotel suite was splintered and kicked wide open. The metal lock hung uselessly from the broken frame. I stepped inside and found Stephen pinned roughly against the wallpaper by a man with shoulders the size of a freight engine. Before I could process the violent breach, 2 massive hands grabbed the collar of my denim jacket. They lifted me off my feet and slammed me violently down into the sturdy oak chair at the center of the dining room.
The breath was knocked from my lungs. I looked up. 3 heavily armed enforcers surrounded the glass table. Out of the shadows of the hotel suite stepped Carmine. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most men made in a year. His presence suffocated the room. He did not look like a businessman making a casual inquiry. He looked like a ruthless predator cornering his prey. Carmine pulled a silver chair out and sat directly across from me.
He placed a heavy hand on the glass table. Your son made a very specific promise to me this afternoon, Deandre, Carmine stated. His voice was a low, grating rumble that carried absolute malice. He signed a commercial contract and took a massive cash advance from my firm. Then I found out he sold me city property, Jordan swore to me that he had access to a $50 million union pension fund. He promised me $800,000 by the end of the week.
I am not waiting 48 hours. I want my money right now, and I know you are the one holding the keys. I looked at the three enforcers standing over me. One of them rested his hand purposefully on the heavy firearm holstered at his hip. Stephen was still pinned against the wall, his face pale with raw terror. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Carmine. I adjusted my jacket and leaned forward. "Let Stephen go," I commanded quietly. "If you want the absolute truth about your money, you need his laptop." Carmine stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He flicked his wrist. The enforcer released Stephen, who stumbled forward, gasping for air. I instructed Stephen to open the encrypted laptop and place it between Carmine and me on the glass table. My hands were perfectly steady. I typed in my secondary authorization codes and pulled up the active financial ledgers. I turned the screen toward Carmine. I pointed to the frozen escrow account containing the $800,000 Jordan had originally attempted to wire offshore. "The money is legally locked,"
I explained with absolute certainty. "Jordan never had access to the union pension funds. He lied to you to save his own life. He tried to execute a hostile cyber attack on the union servers an hour ago using legacy administrative backdoors. He failed completely. He triggered a federal cybersecurity alarm. He downloaded a highly classified tracking packet. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security are currently hunting him down across the city."
I could see the gears turning behind his dark eyes. He was weighing the cost of vengeance against the price of his own freedom. My delivery was utterly flawless, stripped of any emotion that might indicate a bluff. I laid the facts bare. Carmine leaned closer to the screen, his dark eyes narrowing as he read the federal lock status on the banking interface. He realized the extreme gravity of the situation instantly. "Jordan is a desperate sinking ship." I continued, my voice unwavering. "If you accept a single dollar from him, you are actively receiving stolen federal funds. The government will trace that transaction directly to your commercial development firm. They will freeze every single construction project you have in this state. They will hit you with massive federal racketeering charges and seize your entire real estate empire under aggressive RICO laws. You will lose absolutely everything for a fraction of what your portfolio is worth. You are a smart businessman, Carmine. You do not risk a billion-dollar empire for an $800,000 mistake made by a foolish, arrogant lawyer."
I did not feel a trace of fear sitting across from this violent man. I had spent the late 90s fighting to expand the Atlanta freight yards. During that era, the loading docks were infested with corrupt mob-tied developers who used brutal intimidation tactics to break union strikes. They would send armed men to the shipping containers in the middle of the night to threaten my workers. I had faced men far more dangerous than Carmine in dark alleyways and deserted warehouses.
I learned very early in my career exactly how these criminal syndicates operated. They possessed absolutely no loyalty to anyone but themselves. Their entire existence was built on cold, calculated self-preservation. They worshipped money and survival above all other principles. Carmine was no different from the ruthless thugs I had outmaneuvered 30 years ago. He was an apex predator who only respected someone willing to look him directly in the eye and speak his language. I knew that presenting him with a logical, devastating financial threat was the only way to disarm his physical aggression. He would never risk his own freedom to avenge a botched real estate deal with my disgraced son. Carmine read the federal tracking alerts glowing on the laptop screen. The aggressive posture completely drained from his massive frame. He recognized the undeniable, terrifying truth in my words. He knew I was offering him a critical lifeline to avoid federal prison. He stood up slowly and buttoned his charcoal jacket. He looked at me with a newfound grudging respect. "Your son is a dead man walking," Carmine declared coldly. He signaled to his enforcers. They backed away from the table, lowering their weapons. Carmine pulled out his phone and made a rapid call to his lieutenants, ordering his associates to place a public bounty on Jordan's remaining assets to aggressively recoup the stolen cash advance. They marched out of the shattered hotel door, leaving Stephen and me alone in the quiet suite. Stephen sank heavily into a chair, breathing a deep sigh of relief. We had barely survived the violent encounter. Before we could process the victory, Stephen's secure legal tablet chimed with a blaring red emergency notification. He opened the digital inbox and his face turned stark white. Jordan had retaliated with blinding speed. Stephen looked up at me in sheer horror. Deandre Jordan just filed a malicious, fabricated civil lawsuit in the state court. He officially accused you of severe elder financial abuse, extreme cognitive decline, and the illegal manipulation of corporate assets. A notoriously corrupt judge signed an immediate emergency injunction exactly 3 minutes ago. All of your legitimate bank accounts, including your emergency reserves, have been completely frozen by the court. You have absolutely no access to your legal defense funds. We are completely locked out of the financial system.
Stephen stared at his secure legal tablet with his face drained of all color. The digital notification glared brightly against the screen. Jordan had retaliated with terrifying speed. My son had bypassed standard legal procedures and filed a malicious, fully fabricated civil lawsuit in the state court. He officially accused me of severe elder financial abuse, extreme cognitive decline, and the illegal manipulation of corporate assets.
A notoriously corrupt official named Judge Collins signed an immediate emergency injunction exactly 3 minutes ago. All my legitimate bank accounts, including my emergency reserves and my daily operating funds, were completely frozen by the court. I had absolutely no access to my legal defense funds. We were completely locked out of the financial system. Stephen frantically attempted to log into his firm retainer account,
only to find that the judicial order had placed a sweeping hold on any financial transactions associated with my Social Security number. Jordan had effectively cut off our oxygen supply. He knew he could not beat me in a fair fight, so he used the legal system to bind my hands and starve me out. He intended to leave me penniless and unable to pay Stephen or continue fighting this battle. I looked at the red text on the screen. The anger in my chest consolidated into a cold, sharp focus. Jordan thought he had checkmated me. He forgot that I spent decades dismantling corrupt systems piece by piece.
I did not panic. I pulled up a chair next to Stephen and instructed him to close my banking portal immediately. I told him we needed to stop looking at my accounts and start looking directly at Judge Collins. In the state of Georgia, emergency injunctions of this magnitude require extensive evidentiary hearings, but Collins had signed the order in less than an hour. That level of judicial speed was never free. It was purchased.
Stephen accessed public judicial records and cross-referenced them with the forensic data he had already pulled from Jordan's hard drives. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously tracing a complex web of shell companies and political action committees. Stephen's fingers flew across the keyboard, breaking down layers of corporate obfuscation and dead-end accounts. Then we found the undeniable smoking gun.
Exactly 3 days after Jordan and Audrey fraudulently cashed out my late wife's hidden life insurance policy, a massive wire transfer was routed through a Cayman Islands holding company. The money was then meticulously broken down into dozens of smaller, untraceable donations. Those donations were funneled directly into a massive political campaign fund controlled entirely by Judge Collins' wife. Jordan had not just stolen from a dead woman to fund his extravagant lifestyle. I had actively used my late wife's life insurance payout to bribe a sitting state judge. He purchased his legal shield using the very money he stole from my family. The paper trail was absolutely undeniable. Stephen pulled up the routing numbers, matching them perfectly to the fraudulent signatures the corrupt notary had stamped. The sheer audacity of the crime was staggering. Jordan had utilized a dead woman's legacy to buy the judicial gavel he was now swinging at my head. Stephen looked at me in complete disbelief, stating that this level of judicial bribery would result in federal prison sentences for everyone involved, including the corrupt judge. I nodded slowly. I told Stephen to compile every single routing number, every hidden donation receipt, and every fraudulent signature into a single devastating physical dossier. We were not going to file a formal complaint through the proper channels. Bureaucracy would take months, and I needed my bank accounts unfrozen today.
I watched the laser printer spit out the damning evidence page by page. My mind drifted back to Jordan's early days as a junior corporate lawyer. I remembered sitting at his kitchen table over a decade ago, listening to him brag about securing a favorable ruling for a toxic chemical company. He had smirked over his expensive scotch, boasting that justice in this city was simply a commodity sold to the highest bidder. He claimed he bought the ruling by treating the presiding judge to a lavish, off-the-books golf trip in Scotland. I had scolded him that night, warning him that a career built on bribery was a fragile house of cards waiting to collapse under its own weight. I spent my entire life negotiating fair wages for hard-working men on the shipping docks, relying on grit and honesty. He had rolled his eyes, calling me a naive old man who did not understand how the modern world actually worked. He genuinely believed his expensive degrees made him smarter than the consequences of his actions. His entire legal career was built on these illicit transactions. He had normalized corruption so deeply in his own mind that he thought nothing of using his mother's stolen life insurance to buy another ruling against his own father.
I took the thick paper dossier from Stephen and drove directly to a high-end steakhouse in the affluent Buckhead district. I knew Judge Collins lunched there every Thursday afternoon. I walked past the host stand ignoring their loud protests and approached the judge's private corner booth. He was enjoying a premium ribeye cut, completely unbothered by the lives he ruined for cash. I tossed the heavy dossier directly onto his plate, knocking over his expensive wine glass. I leaned down and quietly informed him that he had exactly 10 minutes to completely lift the injunction against me and recuse himself from my son's fabricated lawsuit. If he refused, I would walk directly to the federal courthouse and hand the unredacted bribery documents to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Judge Collins turned the color of ash. He opened the folder, saw his wife's campaign accounts linked to the stolen insurance money, and began shaking violently. He pulled out his phone right then and there, calling his clerk to immediately vacate the injunction. My bank accounts were fully restored before I even walked out the restaurant doors. I returned to the downtown hotel suite feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. I opened the door, expecting to find Stephen working on the next legal maneuver. Instead, the suite was completely trashed. Heavy furniture was overturned, the glass tables were shattered, and Stephen was nowhere to be seen. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. Jordan lunged at me from the darkness, his eyes wild and violent, desperate to physically destroy the evidence that was dismantling his entire life. The shadow that detached itself from the corner of the ruined hotel suite was my own son. Jordan lunged at me from the darkness with the frantic, uncoordinated desperation of a cornered animal. His expensive tailored suit was torn at the shoulder and soaked with sweat. The polished, arrogant corporate lawyer who had slapped my chest with dollar bills just 48 hours ago was completely gone. In his place was a wild-eyed feral man whose entire fraudulent empire was collapsing around him. He gripped a heavy brass table lamp in his right hand. He swung it violently toward the glass desk, shattering the remaining surface into 1,000 jagged pieces. He was blindly searching for Stephen's encrypted laptop. He believed that if he could physically destroy the hard drives, he could erase the federal tracking data and the irrefutable evidence of his bribery. He let out a guttural scream of pure frustration when he realized the computer was nowhere to be found. He turned his manic gaze toward me. He dropped the brass lamp and charged across the room. He shoved me hard against the wall, his hands gripping the lapels of my denim jacket. He screamed that I had ruined his life. He spat venomous accusations, blaming me for the frozen bank accounts, the collapsed commercial real estate deal, and the federal arrest warrants looming over his head. He raised his fist, preparing to strike my face. I wanted to physically punish me for refusing to lay down and die quietly. Jordan had never been in a real physical altercation in his entire life. I had raised him in the quiet, manicured suburbs of Atlanta. I paid for private schools and safe neighborhoods, specifically to shield him from the violence I had grown up around. He only knew how to use legal jargon, corporate intimidation, and stolen money as his weapons. He believed that, because I was 70 years old, I was frail and defenseless. He fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of survival. I did not spend my youth behind a mahogany desk. I spent 4 decades surviving the brutal, unforgiving realities of the Atlanta freight yards. I had broken up vicious brawls between massive, enraged longshoremen fighting over union contracts. I knew exactly how to read a man's shifting center of gravity. I knew how to redirect blind aggression. As Jordan threw his sloppy, uncoordinated punch, I did not flinch. I sidestepped his strike with practiced efficiency. I reached up and grabbed his extended wrist. I twisted his arm downward using my own body weight, applying sharp, localized pressure to his joint. He let out a sharp gasp of pain as his knees buckled. I forced him down onto the carpeted floor amidst the shattered glass. I pinned his arm firmly behind his back, pressing my knee securely against his shoulder blade to neutralize his movement. He struggled wildly beneath me, gasping for air, demanding that I let him go. I leaned down close to his ear. I told him to stop fighting and looked directly at the wooden bookshelf across the room. Jordan gritted his teeth and turned his head. Resting inconspicuously between 2 heavy volumes was my burner phone. The camera lens was pointed directly at us. A small green indicator light was blinking steadily on the screen. I am not just recording this assault, Jordan. I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I am actively live streaming this entire physical encounter to a secure external server. That server is currently being monitored by the local police precinct and the district attorney's office. I anticipated that you would attempt to destroy the digital evidence by force once your corrupt judge lifted the injunction. You just broke into my hotel suite, destroyed private property.
And committed felony assault against a senior citizen on a live, unalterable federal feed. You just added 10 more years to your inevitable prison sentence. The fight instantly drained out of his body. He went completely limp beneath my grip. The horrifying reality of his situation washed over him. He had handed the prosecution the exact physical evidence they needed to deny him bail. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room was suddenly broken by a sound echoing from the city streets below. It was the distinct, high-pitched wail of approaching police sirens. They were growing louder by the second, converging directly on us. They were growing louder by the second, converging directly on our hotel location. The authorities had seen the live feed.
Jordan panicked. It was a raw, primal terror. He wrenched his shoulder free with a violent jerk, tearing his expensive suit jacket. He scrambled to his feet, slipping on the broken glass. He did not run toward the main door. He bolted straight toward the shattered window leading out to the fire escape. He threw his leg over the metal railing and scrambled down the iron stairs, disappearing into the dark, rain-soaked alleys of the city like a common thief. I stood up slowly,
brushing the glass from my jeans. I did not chase him. The federal authorities would hunt him down before sunrise. The door to the adjoining bathroom slowly creaked open. Stephen stepped out into the ruined living room, clutching his heavy encrypted laptop tightly against his chest. He was breathing heavily, having locked himself inside the reinforced bathroom the moment Jordan kicked down the front door. Stephen placed the laptop on the only intact table and immediately checked the data integrity. The hard drives were perfectly safe. The evidence of the judicial bribery, the offshore accounts,
and the forged life insurance documents remained completely untouched. Stephen's cell phone rang sharply in his pocket. He answered it, putting the device on speakerphone. It was Deshaun, my cybersecurity contact at the union headquarters. Deshaun's voice was urgent and highly focused.
"Deandre, we have a major shift in the board,"
Deshaun reported rapidly. "I just intercepted a mass digital invitation sent out from Audrey's private email server. She is not hiding from the federal tax evasion charges. She is doubling down. She is hosting a massive exclusive gala at her luxury wellness spa right now. She invited dozens of her high society friends and wealthy corporate investors. She is actively soliciting emergency cash investments under the guise of an elite business expansion.
She is trying to secure enough untraceable cash tonight to charter a private flight to Paris before the federal agents freeze her passport."
I looked at Stephen. The corruption in my family was a dual-headed snake, and Audrey was attempting to slither away while Jordan took the fall. She had built her entire elitist empire using the money stolen from my late wife's life insurance policy. She used that spa to mock my blue-collar roots, parading her ill-gotten wealth while I swept floors at the community center. She was currently standing in a ballroom funded by a corpse begging rich socialites to finance her escape from justice. "Grab the laptop," Steve and I commanded, walking toward the hotel door. "We are going to that gala. It is time to show Audrey's wealthy friends exactly what kind of foundation her luxury business is truly built upon."
The drive to the affluent district of Buckhead took less than 20 minutes. Stephen and I pulled into the circular valet driveway of Audrey's luxury wellness spa. The building was a massive modern structure made entirely of imported glass and white marble. It was a monument to excessive vanity. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open the doors of expensive sports cars and luxury sedans. I stepped out of my rusty Ford truck, leaving it parked directly in the VIP drop-off lane. The valet attendant tried to protest, but a single hard look from me silenced him instantly. Stephen grabbed his heavy encrypted laptop, and we walked shoulder to shoulder through the towering glass doors. The grand ballroom was packed with the most elite socialites and corporate investors in Atlanta. Waiters circled the room, carrying trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers. I walked straight into the center of the room. I was still wearing my faded denim jacket and scuffed work boots. The contrast between my working-class reality and their manufactured opulence was blinding. The wealthy guests stopped their conversations to stare at me with open disgust. Audrey was standing near a massive ice sculpture, laughing with a group of potential investors. She turned her head and saw me. The arrogant smile vanished from her perfectly contoured face, replaced by absolute, unadulterated panic. She dropped her champagne flute. The glass shattered loudly against the marble floor. She frantically waved her hands, signaling for the two burly private security guards standing by the entrance to remove me immediately. The guards moved toward me with heavy, aggressive steps. I did not retreat a single inch. I squared my shoulders and planted my boots firmly on the polished marble. I had spent my entire life breaking up violent strikes on the freight docks. Two overpaid club bouncers in cheap suits did not intimidate me in the slightest. Before they could reach within an arm's length, Stephen intercepted them. He flashed his federal legal credentials and warned them that touching me would result in immediate felony assault charges. The guards hesitated, looking back at Audrey for confirmation. That brief hesitation was all the time I needed. I bypassed the security detail and marched directly toward the main presentation stage at the front of the ballroom. A young audio-visual technician was sitting behind a complex soundboard. I placed my heavy hand on his shoulder and quietly instructed him to step aside. He took one look at my unyielding expression and abandoned his post immediately. Stephen slid into the technician's chair and connected his encrypted laptop directly into the main projection system. I grabbed the wireless microphone from the pristine acrylic podium. I tapped the metal grill twice. The sharp, booming feedback echoed through the massive ballroom, instantly silencing the classical music and the remaining whispers of the wealthy crowd. Every single eye in the room was locked completely onto me. Audrey tried to run toward the stage to grab the microphone from my hands. She screamed that I was a crazy homeless trespasser who was trying to ruin her exclusive business event. I raised the microphone to my mouth. I did not yell. I spoke with the calm, crushing authority of a man delivering a final verdict. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask for your brief attention," I announced. My voice resonated from the high vaulted ceilings. "My name is Deandre. The woman frantically screaming at you is my daughter-in-law. You are all gathered here tonight because Audrey has asked you for emergency capital investments to expand this magnificent wellness spa. I am here to ensure you are fully informed before you write her a single check." I nodded to Stephen. He pressed a button on his keyboard. The massive digital projector screen behind me illuminated instantly. The screen displayed a series of certified bank seizure documents emblazoned with heavy red federal stamps. "The building you are currently standing inside is under active foreclosure," I stated clearly. The corporate bank accounts associated with this business were entirely frozen by federal authorities less than 3 hours ago. The owner of this establishment is currently under investigation for massive international tax evasion, wire fraud, and grand larceny. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of high society investors. They stared up at the undeniable legal documents flashing across the enormous screen. Audrey froze at the base of the stage. Her face turned the color of ash. She opened her mouth to deny the accusations, but Stephen was already pulling up the next piece of devastating evidence. The screen shifted to display the forged life insurance policy. "Audrey has spent the last 5 years mocking my modest home." I continued, my voice echoing with righteous anger. "She paraded this luxury spa around Atlanta, proudly claiming it represented her self-made generational wealth. She boasted about her brilliant business acumen to every country club socialite in the city. The truth is much darker. This entire establishment was built on the foundation of a stolen corpse. The document you see behind me is a forged life insurance policy. It belonged to my late wife. Audrey and my son manipulated the paperwork while I was burying the woman I loved for 40 years. They stole $250,000 from a grieving widower to purchase the marble floors you are currently standing on. She despises the blue-collar sweat of the working class, yet she eagerly built her fake empire using money stolen from a dead blue-collar wife. You are not investing in a luxury wellness brand tonight. You are funding the desperate escape plan of a cornered criminal who intends to flee to Paris before the Federal Bureau of Investigation kicks down her front door." The wealthy investors did not need to hear another word. High society elites value their reputations above all else. The sheer terror of being legally tied to federal wire fraud and embezzlement sent them into a complete frenzy. They abandoned their champagne glasses on the tables and rushed toward the grand exit doors in a massive chaotic wave. They completely ignored Audrey as she desperately grabbed at their expensive suits, begging them to stay and listen to her side of the story. Within 3 minutes, the grand ballroom was entirely empty. The only people left were Stephen, myself, and a completely shattered Audrey. The silence in the massive room was deafening. Audrey fell to her knees on the marble floor. Her phone buzzed sharply in her designer handbag. She pulled it out with trembling hands. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she read the automated federal notification on her screen. Her passport had been officially flagged and suspended by the United States government. She was permanently grounded. She could not leave the country. She crawled toward the edge of the stage, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. She begged me for mercy. She promised she would return every single stolen penny if I just called the federal authorities and told them it was a massive misunderstanding. I looked down at her with absolute indifference. "You wanted my money, Audrey," I said quietly. "Now you have to pay the price."
I turned my back on her weeping form and walked out of the spa with Stephen at my side. We reached the truck and climbed inside. Before I could turn the ignition key, my burner phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the frantic, terrified text message glowing on the screen. It was from my teenage granddaughter, Tiana. The message read that Jordan had just arrived at her boarding school. He was physically grabbing her, aggressively demanding she empty her secure college trust fund to pay for his illegal escape across the border. I threw my rusty truck into gear and tore out of the wellness spa parking lot. The tires screeched against the polished concrete as I sped toward the northern suburbs. Tiana was attending an elite private boarding school exactly 20 miles away. My granddaughter had sent a text message filled with raw panic. Jordan had bypassed the campus security gate and cornered her near the student dormitories. He was aggressively demanding she sign over the entirety of her secure college trust fund to finance his illegal escape across the southern border. I navigated the heavy Atlanta traffic with reckless precision. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the academy and spotted them immediately in the visitor parking area. Jordan was completely unhinged. His expensive tailored suit was ruined. It was covered in dirt and sweat from his desperate flight from the hotel. He was physically gripping Tiana by her upper arm. He was pulling her roughly toward his idling rental car. Tiana was pulling back with all her might. Her heavy backpack slipped off her shoulder as she firmly refused to comply with his frantic demands. Jordan screamed at her. His voice was hoarse and cracking with absolute terror.
He told her she owed him her life and that she was going to authorize the wire transfer right now. I slammed on my brakes. I left my truck running diagonally across 2 parking spaces. I did not waste time unbuckling my seatbelt gracefully. I kicked my door open and sprinted across the asphalt.
"Take your hands off my granddaughter right now," I roared. My voice echoed off the brick walls of the dormitory buildings. Jordan whipped his head around. His eyes were bloodshot and wide with feral panic. He did not release his grip on Tiana. Instead, he pulled her closer to his chest. He was using his own daughter as a human shield against his crushing reality. "You stay out of this," Jordan yelled. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "The federal authorities froze my accounts. Carmine put a bounty on my head. I need untraceable cash to get out of the country tonight. Tiana has $200,000 sitting perfectly liquid in her educational trust. I am her legal guardian. I am taking her to the bank right now to authorize a massive cash withdrawal." I marched directly up to him. I did not slow my pace. I forced myself between them. I used my heavy shoulder to break his physical hold on the terrified teenage girl. I pushed Tiana safely behind my broad back.
I formed an impenetrable wall between her and her father. "You are not her legal guardian anymore," I stated with absolute authority. "You are a wanted federal fugitive. You are not taking her anywhere." Jordan lunged forward. He tried to reach around me to grab Tiana by the wrist. I caught his forearm mid-air. I twisted it sharply downward. I forced him to stumble back against the side of his rental car. I warned him that if he took one more step toward her, I would break his arm completely in half. Jordan was sobbing now. It was a pathetic display of a broken man who realized his corporate intimidation tactics were utterly useless. He slammed his fists against the hood of the car. He screamed that I was destroying his only chance at survival. He threatened to drag Tiana away by force if she did not surrender the account routing numbers immediately. He claimed he built her privileged life and she was obligated to sacrifice her entire future to save his. He looked directly at Tiana. He demanded she fulfill her duty as his loyal daughter. He promised her that as soon as he established a safe haven in South America, he would send for her and Audrey. He swore on his life that they would be a wealthy and happy family again.
I felt Tiana pressing against the back of my denim jacket. Tiana was the only person in this corrupted family who actually inherited my moral compass. While Audrey dragged her to country club galas and forced her into designer dresses, Tiana would secretly take the city bus down to the freight yards. She just wanted to eat cheap sandwiches with me on the loading docks. She deeply despised her parents and their superficial lifestyle. She hated the fake smiles and the relentless obsession with social status. She watched her father treat waitresses and mechanics like subhuman garbage, and it completely disgusted her. She admired my quiet strength and my unwavering refusal to bend to corporate elitism. I funded her educational trust entirely in secret. I knew Jordan would eventually try to drain it to buy another sports car or fund a luxury vacation. I made sure Tiana was the sole signatory upon her 18th birthday. She had celebrated that birthday just 2 weeks ago. Jordan knew he could no longer forge a document to steal her money. He needed her physical compliance to authorize the release of the funds.
Tiana stepped out from behind my back. She did not look at her father with fear anymore. She looked at him with absolute and freezing contempt. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. "You are a disgusting liar," Tiana said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "You were never going to send for us. You were going to leave Mom to take the fall for the federal fraud charges while you disappeared forever." Tiana tapped her screen.
A crystal-clear audio recording began to play at maximum volume. It was the sound file I had captured from the hotel room. It was the exact file Audrey had downloaded from his hidden servers. Jordan was speaking on the recording. He coldly told his secret mistress in Savannah that he was abandoning his wife and daughter the moment he secured the getaway cash. Jordan stared at Tiana in absolute horror. His ultimate betrayal was playing out loud from the hands of his own child. The distant rising wail of police sirens suddenly pierced the afternoon air. The sound was approaching rapidly from the main avenue. "I called the police the moment I saw your car pull up to the campus gates," Tiana stated coldly. "You are going to prison." Jordan realized he was completely trapped. He shoved me backward. He spun around and sprinted toward a delivery van idling near the cafeteria loading dock. He ripped the delivery driver out of the seat. He jumped behind the wheel and slammed on the gas. The stolen van tore through the campus exit just as 3 police cruisers swerved into the driveway. They initiated a massive high-speed chase through the city streets. Stephen called my phone with urgent news. The State Bar Association had just called an emergency hearing to officially strip Jordan of his law license. Jordan swerved the stolen delivery van recklessly into the heavy Atlanta afternoon traffic. The police cruisers pursued him with their sirens screaming, but the sheer volume of cars on the interstate worked to his advantage. He took a blind exit weaving through the narrow industrial alleys until he completely lost the police tail. The local news stations instantly broadcasted his face across every channel in the city. My son was no longer just a disgraced corporate lawyer.
It was a highly dangerous wanted federal fugitive on the run. I held my phone to my ear as Stephen relayed the latest update. Tiana was sitting safely in the passenger seat of my truck, completely unharmed but deeply shaken by her father's sheer madness. Stephen told me to drive Tiana back to the secure hotel suite and head straight to the downtown legal district. The Georgia State Bar Association had bypassed their standard bureaucratic delays.
The overwhelming magnitude of Jordan's commercial fraud and the active federal cybercrime alerts had forced their hand. They convened an emergency disciplinary hearing to officially strip Jordan of his license to practice law. They needed my direct testimony to finalize the disbarment. I dropped Tana off with a trusted private security guard at the hotel and drove straight to the Bar Association headquarters. I was going to legally strip away the very last weapon my son possessed. The disciplinary hearing took place in a sterile, windowless boardroom filled with heavy oak furniture and thick leather chairs. 5 senior board members sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. Their faces were grim and completely unreadable. Stephen and I took our seats directly across from them. I did not waste their time with emotional pleas or dramatic speeches. I simply opened Stephen's certified legal folder and began distributing the hard evidence across the polished wood. I handed them the forged power of attorney document, featuring the illegally bought notary stamp. I submitted the fraudulent commercial real estate contract Jordan signed to sell my estate to the developer. I played the crystal-clear audio recording of Jordan explicitly threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. The board members reviewed the documents in absolute horrified silence. The undeniable proof of his cruelty was laid bare. Suddenly, the secure conference telephone in the center of the table blinked with an incoming caller identification. It was Jordan. He was using a prepaid burner phone, but he had dialed into the private legal hearing using his still active state bar identification numbers. He knew this emergency hearing was taking place, and he was arrogant enough to believe he could still manipulate the outcome. The head of the committee answered the call and placed it on speakerphone. Jordan immediately launched into a masterful, heavily rehearsed monologue. He adopted the smooth, polished tone of a deeply concerned professional. He told the panel that I was a hostile, severely cognitively impaired old man who was actively trying to sabotage his brilliant career out of pure irrational spite.
He claimed the documents were completely misunderstood and that he was merely taking difficult steps to manage my rapidly deteriorating mental health. He begged his colleagues to understand the impossible burden of caring for a violent, senile father. He spun a narrative of victimhood, attempting to gaslight the very people who governed his profession. The head of the disciplinary panel was a distinguished older gentleman named Attorney Sullivan. I recognized Sullivan immediately.
He was the senior managing partner who had hired Jordan right out of law school 15 years ago. I remembered sitting across from Sullivan at a celebratory graduation dinner. At that dinner, Jordan had proudly used my union background to prove he understood the struggles of the working class.
Sullivan had looked me in the eye and promised to teach my son the sacred ethics of the legal profession. Sullivan had personally mentored Jordan, trusting him to uphold the integrity of the law. Now Sullivan was sitting in this boardroom looking at irrefutable evidence of gross elder financial abuse. Sullivan saw exactly how Jordan had twisted the very legal system he was sworn to protect in order to aggressively prey on his own vulnerable father.
The profound betrayal Sullivan felt was entirely visible on his weathered face. He listened to Jordan spin his pathetic, manipulative lies through the speakerphone. Sullivan looked at my calloused hands, remembering the proud, hard-working freight union boss he met all those years ago. He felt utter disgust that his former protege would weaponize a prestigious law license to steal an old man's life savings.
Attorney Sullivan leaned forward and pressed his finger near the microphone. He cut off Jordan's polished lies with a voice as cold and sharp as winter ice. He informed Jordan that the audio recording of the psychiatric threat had already been verified by federal authorities. He stated that the forged notary seal was currently under active federal investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sullivan did not ask for further debate or offer Jordan a chance for rebuttal.
He called for an immediate vote from the 5 panel members. The decision took less than 10 seconds. The panel voted unanimously to revoke Jordan's legal credentials. Sullivan leaned closely into the microphone and officially pronounced that Jordan Thompson was permanently disbarred from the practice of law in the state of Georgia. His identity, his corporate power, and his legal shield were instantly incinerated. A heavy, suffocating silence hung over the phone line. Then, a terrifying, guttural scream erupted from the speaker. It was the sound of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Jordan realized his life was completely over. He screamed that if I took away his legacy, he would violently erase mine. He vowed to destroy the one thing I cherished as much as my family. He told me he was driving straight to the Yvonne Thompson Community Center, the building I had funded and built by hand in honor of my late wife. He promised to burn it down to the ashes.
The phone line went completely dead. I bolted out of my leather chair and sprinted for the heavy oak door.
I shoved my phone into my pocket and sprinted out of the Bar Association headquarters. I jumped into my truck and pushed the heavy engine to its absolute limit. I ignored the blaring horns and swerving cars as I tore through the downtown intersections. The Yvonne Thompson Community Center was located 10 miles away in the heart of our old neighborhood. My son had just lost his law license, his reputation, and his freedom. He was a cornered, rabid animal with nothing left to lose.
He knew that destroying the community center was the only way left to inflict profound, irreversible pain on me. I slammed on the brakes and skidded into the center's empty parking lot. The heavy glass front doors were completely shattered. Jagged shards covered the welcome mat. I stepped carefully through the broken frame and rushed down the dark hallway toward the main gymnasium. The overwhelming toxic stench of high-octane gasoline burned my nostrils before I even reached the entrance.
I stepped into the doorway of the expansive basketball court. The emergency exit lights cast a harsh red glow across the room. Jordan was standing in the very center of the polished hardwood floor. He was frantically swinging a heavy red plastic canister in wide arcs, drenching the entire court in highly flammable fuel. His disheveled suit was soaked in sweat and gasoline. He held a silver metal lighter in his trembling right hand, his thumb resting dangerously over the flint wheel.
He looked up and saw me standing in the doorway.
A twisted, manic smile stretched across Jordan's face. He raised the silver lighter high into the air. He screamed that I had systematically destroyed his entire life and stripped away everything he had worked for. He declared that if he was destined to rot in a federal prison cell, he would ensure my legacy burned to the ground first. He blamed me for his failed marriage, his massive debts, and his complete public humiliation.
Han told me that watching this building turn to ash would be his final victory.
I did not raise my hands to beg for mercy. I did not take a single step toward him to try and wrestle the lighter from his grip. I maintained absolute chilling composure. I stepped to the right, positioning myself directly next to a steel utility panel mounted flush against the cinder block wall. I flipped open the clear plastic cover of the master emergency control box. Jordan laughed, mocking my silence.
He pushed his thumb down hard against the flint wheel of the lighter. A bright yellow spark illuminated his desperate face. At that exact fraction of a second, I slammed my fist into the heavy red button set deep inside the metal panel. A deafening mechanical siren instantly erupted throughout the entire facility.
The reinforced steel fire doors located at every exit of the gymnasium violently slammed shut. Heavy magnetic deadbolts locked into place with a resounding, inescapable metallic crash. Jordan jumped back as the main doors sealed him completely inside the cavernous room. He was instantly cut off from the rest of the building. Before he could process the lockdown,
the industrial fire suppression system mounted in the high ceiling activated. Deep pressurized vents snapped open. A thick white cloud of specialized halon gas flooded the gymnasium at terrifying speed. The chemical agent aggressively displaced the oxygen in the room, creating an environment where combustion was physically impossible. Jordan frantically sparked his lighter over and over again. The flint struck the metal repeatedly, but the flame refused to ignite in the oxygen-deprived atmosphere. The gasoline pooling around his expensive leather shoes was rendered completely useless. The halon gas neutralized the volatile fumes in a matter of seconds. Jordan dropped the lighter in sheer panic. He ran toward the reinforced glass window embedded in the heavy steel door where I stood. He slammed his fists against the thick, shatterproof glass. He coughed violently as the suppression gas filled his lungs,
demanding that I release the magnetic locks. I stood completely still on the safe side of the fire door. I watched his desperate, pathetic struggle without an ounce of sympathy. He had brought this absolute ruin upon himself.
Jordan grossly underestimated the architecture of this building. I did not just sign a check to have this community center erected. I built this sanctuary with my own bare hands during the darkest period of my life. After Yvonne passed away, I needed a physical manifestation of her enduring spirit. I spent 2 years laying the concrete foundation, framing the walls, and nailing down every single plank of that hardwood floor alongside my union brothers. I knew exactly how easily vulnerable community spaces could be destroyed by vandalism or corporate negligence. I refused to let my wife's memorial face that fate. I utilized my extensive freight yard connections to secure industrial-grade safety mechanisms. I personally wired and engineered the halon gas suppression system, a defense protocol usually reserved for highly classified data centers.
I designed the magnetic lockdown doors to contain any external threat before it could compromise the structural integrity of the hall. I built this fortress to withstand hurricanes and riots. A spoiled, arrogant corporate lawyer armed with a plastic gas can and a cheap lighter was never going to bring these walls down. My foresight had permanently secured her beautiful memory against his rage. Jordan collapsed onto his knees on the gasoline-soaked floor. His violent coughing fits echoed faintly through the thick steel door. He leaned his forehead against the reinforced glass, utterly defeated and completely stripped of his arrogant power. He was a caged animal waiting for the inevitable. I pulled my burner phone from my jacket pocket and dialed the local police dispatcher. I calmly reported an active arson attempt and a contained suspect at the community center. 3 minutes later, a swarm of police cruisers and a heavy fire engine locked down the perimeter. Heavily armed officers breached the front entrance equipped with oxygen masks. They manually overrode the magnetic doors and dragged my coughing, weeping son out of the gymnasium in heavy steel handcuffs. They officially charged him with felony arson, attempted destruction of property, and fleeing a federal warrant. I watched them shove Jordan into the back of a squad car. My phone vibrated intensely in my hand. It was an urgent call from Steven. His voice carried a new, infuriating tension. Deandre, Steven announced rapidly. We have one final massive legal hurdle. Audrey just retained a high-powered, ruthless defense attorney. She is officially suing for full possession of the frozen offshore money. She is filing a massive civil claim stating she was a victim of severe, prolonged spousal abuse.
She is spinning a completely fabricated narrative portraying Jordan as a tyrannical mastermind who violently forced her to participate in the entire fraud.
The phone call from Steven echoing in my truck cabin shifted my entire focus immediately. Jalen was securely locked inside a federal holding cell, coughing on suppression gas and facing decades in prison, but Megan was already launching her desperate counteroffensive. She had hired a ruthless, high-powered defense attorney to file a massive civil claim. She was actively painting herself as a terrified victim of profound spousal abuse to secure half of the frozen offshore funds.
I knew exactly how to crush her fabricated narrative and destroy her final safety net. We needed to cut the head off her legal snake by exposing her direct, willing involvement in the initial fraud. I instructed Steven to track down Travis Collins, the corrupt notary who had illegally stamped my late wife's forged life insurance documents. Steven utilized his extensive skip-tracing software and located Travis hiding in a rundown cash-only motel on the desolate outskirts of the city limits.
Travis knew his fraudulent signature on those documents would draw federal attention the moment Jalen was arrested. so he had packed his bags and fled the public eye in sheer panic. I drove my heavy truck straight to the crumbling motel complex and parked completely out of sight. The flickering neon vacancy sign buzzed aggressively in the damp night air. I walked down the dark exterior corridor to room 12 and knocked heavily on the peeling wooden door. Travis opened it a fraction of an inch,
peeking through the rusted chain lock with wide, terrified eyes. I slammed my heavy work boot against the door frame, snapping the chain completely off the wall and forcing my way into the dimly lit room.
Travis stumbled backward, tripping over a half-packed suitcase lying open on the stained carpet. He scrambled to his feet, trying to project a false sense of authority to hide his trembling hands. He demanded to know what I was doing and threatened to call the local police to report a home invasion. I did not waste a single breath engaging with his pathetic bluster. I reached inside my thick denim jacket and pulled out a tightly bound ledger Stephen had compiled over the last 3 hours.
I tossed the heavy stack of papers directly onto the cheap laminate table. I told Travis that calling the police was the absolute worst decision he could make tonight. I calmly advised him to open the ledger and read the contents carefully before he spoke another word. Travis reached out with shaking fingers and flipped open the heavy cover, his face instantly drained of all remaining color.
Stephen had systematically breached the county municipal archives and cross-referenced every single document Travis had notarized over the past 10 years. The ledger contained irrefutable hard evidence of over 40 separate instances where Travis had accepted untraceable cash bribes to authorize fraudulent real estate transfers, fake wills, and illicit corporate contracts. I watched his eyes dart rapidly across the pages as he realized the sheer magnitude of the trap closing tightly around him. I stepped closer, forcing him to look directly into my eyes without looking away. I presented him with an absolute non-negotiable ultimatum. I told Travis that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was currently building a massive racketeering case against my son. If I handed this specific ledger to the federal prosecutor,
Travis would face a minimum of 30 consecutive years in a maximum security federal prison for systemic corporate fraud. He would die behind cold concrete walls. However, if he handed over the original unaltered life insurance documents and agreed to testify exactly how Megan orchestrated the forgery, I would ensure the ledger remained buried forever. Travis tried to negotiate a better deal. He whined that Megan's high-powered lawyers would destroy his life if he turned against her in a court of law. I leaned down until my face was inches from his sweating forehead. I reminded him that Megan was a sinking ship with entirely frozen bank accounts, while I held the definitive power to obliterate his entire existence with a single phone call. He had to choose his executioner. I knew exactly how a man like Travis operated when his livelihood was actively threatened by a superior force. 30 years ago, Travis used to work as a low-level dispatch clerk at the Atlanta freight yards. He was a scrawny, opportunistic coward who routinely skimmed small amounts of cash from the union operational funds to pay off his gambling debts. When I caught him stealing from my hard-working men, I cornered him in the shipping container yard late at night. He cried and begged for his job, swearing on his life he would never steal again. I chose to show him mercy. I fired him quietly instead of pressing criminal charges or letting the angry longshoreman break his legs. I realized tonight that my past mercy had simply allowed him to transition into a much more dangerous level of white-collar crime. He traded stealing union cash for selling fraudulent legal stamps to the highest bidder. I was not going to make the mistake of showing him an ounce of leniency a second time. Cowards like Travis possess absolutely no loyalty to anyone but themselves. They operate entirely on self-preservation. When faced with the terrifying reality of federal prison, I knew he would eagerly sell out his own mother to save his skin, let alone a desperate socialite like Megan. Travis completely broke down under the suffocating, inescapable pressure. He fell heavily into the rickety motel chair, burying his face in his shaking hands, sobbing that he just wanted to walk away clean from this entire disaster. He crawled over to his overturned suitcase and ripped open the hidden fabric lining with frantic fingers. He pulled out a crumpled, heavy manila envelope and handed it to me without making eye contact. I opened the flap and pulled out the original, unaltered life insurance documents. They were not just the forged copies submitted to the bank. These papers featured Megan's distinct looping handwriting scrawled across the margins in blue ink, proving definitively that she had personally drafted the fraudulent terms and physically directed the illegal transfer of funds. She had paid Travis $10,000 in cash to backdate the federal forms. I secured the devastating evidence inside my jacket and turned my back on the weeping coward. I finally had the ultimate proof required to absolutely crush her fabricated victim narrative.
I walked out of the cheap motel and drove back to the city. I called Stephen from the road and instructed him to finalize our preparations immediately. Megan was scheduled to give her sworn testimony at a civil deposition early the next morning. She believed she was walking into a routine legal meeting to claim her stolen millions and play the victim. She had no idea she was stepping directly onto a battlefield where I held the exact weapon to obliterate her entire future. The civil deposition took place in a sterile glass-walled conference room high above the busy Atlanta streets. I sat quietly next to Stephen at the long mahogany table. Audrey sat directly across from us. She had entirely abandoned her designer silk dresses and heavy makeup. She wore a modest beige cardigan and held a crumpled tissue playing the role of a terrified, manipulated housewife to absolute perfection. Her newly hired defense attorney, a ruthless corporate litigator named Vance, immediately went on the offensive. He did not ask questions about the stolen offshore funds. He aggressively attacked my mental competence. Vance paced around the heavy wooden table, loudly claiming that I was a tyrannical, cognitively impaired patriarch who ruled my family through fear and financial abuse. He stated that Jordan was the true mastermind of the entire fraud and that Audrey was simply a helpless victim trapped in a toxic, abusive marriage. Vance looked directly at me and demanded I admit to suffering from severe memory lapses. He insisted that I fabricated the narrative of her involvement simply because I harbored a deep-seated hatred for my daughter-in-law. Audrey let out a perfectly timed trembling sob, dabbing her dry eyes with the tissue. She was attempting to use the very real trauma of domestic abuse as a cheap shield to steal half of the frozen offshore money. She thought she could manipulate the legal arbitrator by playing the fragile victim. I did not rise to the bait. I simply looked at Stephen and gave him a curt nod. Stephen stood up and smoothly interrupted Vance mid-sentence. Stephen informed the room that we had a late addition to the witness list who could provide absolute clarity regarding Audrey's supposedly passive role in the conspiracy. The heavy conference room doors opened. 2 private security guards escorted Travis Collins into the room. Audrey dropped her crumpled tissue. The performance instantly drained from her face as she stared at the corrupt notary she had paid to secure her stolen empire. Travis took a seat at the far end of the table. He was sweating profusely, terrified of the federal prison sentence hanging over his head. Stephen placed the original unaltered life insurance documents onto the table. Travis testified under oath that Jordan was not even in the room when the forgery took place. Travis stated clearly for the official record that Audrey personally drove to his obscure motel office. He confirmed she handed him exactly $10,000 in untraceable cash to illegally backdate the federal forms. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Audrey, identifying her looping handwriting in the margins where she had drafted the fraudulent transfer terms herself. Vance tried to object, claiming the testimony was coerced, but Stephen was already pulling up his encrypted presentation. Stephen connected his laptop to the room's primary monitor. He projected a highly detailed financial ledger onto the large screen. The ledger meticulously tracked every single dollar from my late wife's stolen life insurance policy. The money did not go into a joint marital account. It bypassed Jordan entirely. The funds were routed directly into a private commercial account registered exclusively to Audrey. Stephen displayed the itemized bank receipts, proving Audrey used that exact stolen money to sign the commercial lease, purchase imported marble, and hire the elite staff for her luxury wellness spa. She had not been coerced into signing anything. She was the primary financial beneficiary and the active willing architect of the entire embezzlement scheme. She had directed the flow of the stolen cash to secure her own vanity project. She stared at the projection screen in sheer horror. The meticulously documented paper trail left absolutely no room for interpretation or legal maneuvering. Every wire transfer, every fraudulent signature, and every cash withdrawal was laid bare for the arbitrator to see. For years, Audrey had weaponized that wellness spa to belittle my working-class background. During family dinners, she would loudly boast about being a self-made female entrepreneur who built a generational empire from the ground up. She constantly ridiculed my calloused hands, and my union pension, claiming her refined business acumen was the only reason our family had any true social standing in Atlanta. She demanded absolute respect from everyone around her, presenting herself as a pinnacle of high society success. The undeniable evidence glowing on the conference room monitor completely shattered her carefully constructed fake reality. She was not a brilliant entrepreneur. She was a common thief who funded her extravagant vanity project by robbing a grieving widower. The absolute destruction of her pristine public image hit her harder than any legal threat ever could. She realized her entire identity was officially exposed as a total fraud.
She had spent her entire adult life running from her own family's financial ruin, adopting a mask of superiority to hide her deep-seated insecurities. Now that mask was ripped away in a room full of legal professionals, leaving her completely naked and exposed to the harsh light of justice. Vance stared at the projected bank statements and the undeniable proof of his client's active perjury. A high-powered attorney values his state bar license above any retainer fee. Vance slammed his legal pad shut. He announced on the official record that he could no longer represent a client actively engaging in ongoing fraud and perjury. He packed his leather briefcase and walked out of the conference room without looking back. Audrey watched her expensive legal shield abandon her.
The reality of her impending federal prison sentence finally snapped her fragile sanity. She let out a visceral, blood-curdling scream. She launched herself across the mahogany table, knocking over heavy chairs and sending glass pitchers crashing to the floor. She lunged directly at my throat, her manicured claws extended. The two private security guards intercepted her mid-air. They wrestled her to the carpet, pinning her arms behind her back as she thrashed and spat vile curses at me. I remained perfectly seated, adjusting my denim jacket. The court-appointed arbitrator officially terminated the deposition ruling, immediately to dismiss her fraudulent civil claim with extreme prejudice and ordering her to pay full financial restitution to my estate. I walked out of the glass-walled room with my assets permanently secured. My phone buzzed with an automated legal notification from the district attorney.
The federal criminal trial for Jordan and Audrey was officially scheduled to begin on Monday morning. They had completely exhausted their tricks, and it was time for them to face a jury. The weekend passed in a tense, methodical blur as Stephen and I prepared for the federal criminal trial. Early Sunday morning, we sat in the polished conference room of the district attorney's office. The heavy oak doors swung open. Jordan's lead criminal defense attorney, a sharp man in a tailored pinstripe suit, walked into the room carrying a thin leather briefcase. He did not offer a polite greeting or attempt to feign professional courtesy. He slid a single,
crisp sheet of paper across the long wooden table. The document outlined a desperate last-minute plea deal. Jordan was offering to immediately surrender every remaining penny of his hidden assets and fully return the stolen offshore funds. In exchange, the defense attorney demanded that I formally withdraw my victim impact statement and petition the federal judge for maximum leniency regarding my son's sentencing. Jordan was absolutely terrified of the mandatory minimums attached to federal wire fraud and severe elder abuse. He knew my personal testimony in front of a jury would utterly destroy any chance he had of securing a reduced prison term. He honestly believed he could simply buy his way out of a federal cage using the very money he had embezzled from my late wife's estate. He wanted to purchase my silence. I picked up the single sheet of paper from the table.
I read the legal jargon detailing his pathetic attempt to bargain away his crimes. I placed the document back down with firm resolve.
I looked directly at the defense attorney and pushed the paper back across the mahogany table. I stated with absolute clarity that I would not withdraw a single word of my testimony. I informed him that my silence was not for sale and that Jordan would face the absolute maximum penalty the law allowed. The defense attorney packed up his briefcase in sheer frustration and stormed out of the conference room. The rejection of the plea deal triggered a massive,
immediate chain reaction between my son and his wife. The moment Jordan realized I would not provide him legal cover, he completely turned his legal crosshairs onto Audrey. He formally filed an aggressive pretrial motion claiming Audrey was the exclusive mastermind behind the entire financial conspiracy. Jordan's legal team asserted that Audrey manipulated his access to the union servers and forced him to orchestrate the property theft to fund her failing luxury wellness spa.
Audrey retaliated with blinding speed. She hired a new ruthless criminal litigator who immediately filed a counter motion. Her defense team painted Jordan as a tyrannical, abusive patriarch who controlled every aspect of their finances and coerced her into participating in the forgery under the direct threat of violence. The united front they had maintained while humiliating me in my own backyard was completely shattered. They were two cornered predators actively tearing each other apart to secure a lighter sentence. They willingly exposed their most intimate secrets, leaking details of Jordan's hidden second family and Audrey's chronic tax evasion to the public record. Their respective legal teams engaged in a vicious, highly public war of attrition. They flooded the federal docket with subpoenas and sworn affidavits designed solely to incriminate the other spouse.
Stephen monitored this barrage of court filings with quiet satisfaction. He pointed out that their mutual destruction was saving the federal prosecutors an immense amount of labor. Jordan and Audrey were effectively doing the government's job by providing irrefutable evidence against one another. They were so consumed by their own selfish desire for self-preservation that they completely ignored the foundational strength of the prosecution's case. I watched their luxurious,
Perfectly curated life disintegrate into a messy public spectacle. They had spent their entire marriage projecting an image of untouchable corporate allure and high society elegance. Now their names were splashed across the front pages of local newspapers, synonymous with greed, betrayal, and absolute moral bankruptcy. I felt no pity for either of them. I only focused on the impending trial, ensuring that they would never escape justice. I sat in the quiet conference room and reflected on the 40 years of marriage I shared with my late wife, Yvonne. We started our life together with absolutely nothing. We lived in a cramped, drafty apartment near the noisy industrial train tracks. We survived crushing poverty, systemic racism, and endless grueling work shifts through absolute unwavering loyalty to one another. Yvonne never demanded expensive gifts or superficial social status.
We built our entire foundation on profound mutual respect and an unbreakable emotional bond. We stood shoulder to shoulder against every single hardship the world threw at us. Watching my son's marriage implode so violently over pure, unadulterated greed reinforced my iron resolve. Jordan and Audrey possessed millions of dollars, yet they possessed zero actual loyalty. They turned on each other the exact moment their superficial wealth was threatened by genuine consequences.
They built their entire partnership on a transactional foundation of vanity and elitism. Their rapid, vicious betrayal of one another stood in stark, sickening contrast to the sacred vows I had honored every single day of my adult life. Seeing the hollow reality of their bond confirmed I was making the right choice. The federal criminal trial officially began on Monday morning. The massive courthouse building was swarming with aggressive reporters and eager news crews. Stephen and I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the main courtroom. The expansive gallery was packed to absolute capacity. Rows of tough, calloused men from the Atlanta Freight Union sat shoulder to shoulder on the left side of the aisle, showing their quiet, unyielding support for me. On the right side of the aisle sat the wealthy socialites and panicked corporate investors who had previously attended Jordan's backyard networking events. They were all desperate to witness the spectacular downfall of the man who nearly dragged them into a massive federal racketeering scandal. I took my seat directly behind the federal prosecutor. The heavy wooden door near the judge's bench opened, and Jordan was escorted into the room by armed federal marshals. He wore a standard-issue prison uniform that completely stripped away his corporate armor. However, his arrogant demeanor remained fiercely intact. When the defense opened its case, Jordan confidently took the witness stand. He adjusted the microphone and looked directly at the jury box. He immediately launched into a highly rehearsed, deeply manipulative performance. He adopted the smooth, polished tone of a profoundly misunderstood professional. He spoke directly to the jurors, attempting to charm them with his refined legal rhetoric. He was preparing to spin a masterful emotional lie about a loving son, trying to protect an aging, confused father from ultimate financial ruin.
The heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom swung open. Jordan took the witness stand, his wrists free of handcuffs for the duration of his testimony. Despite the standard-issue prison uniform replacing his tailored designer suits, his arrogant demeanor remained fiercely intact. He adjusted the microphone with the practiced ease of an elite corporate litigator and looked directly at the jury box. He immediately launched into a highly rehearsed, deeply manipulative performance.
He adopted the smooth, polished tone of a profoundly misunderstood professional burdened by an impossible family tragedy. He spoke directly to the jurors, attempting to charm them with his refined rhetoric. He spun a masterful emotional lie about a loving son, desperately trying to protect an aging, confused father from ultimate financial ruin. Jordan forced tears to well up in his eyes, his voice cracking perfectly on cue as he described watching my supposed cognitive decline. He claimed I was a danger to myself, squandering my hard-earned union pension, and that his drastic actions were motivated entirely by profound familial love and a desperate need to secure my medical care. He painted himself as a martyr, sacrificing his own reputation to save a hostile, paranoid old man. He dabbed his eyes with a tissue provided by the bailiff, maintaining direct eye contact with the sympathetic jurors in the front row. He swore under oath that the offshore wire transfers were simply a mismanaged attempt to set up a secure medical trust fund for my declining years. It was a brilliant, sickeningly flawless performance that almost made me question my own reality.
The lead federal prosecutor, a sharp and unyielding woman who had spent weeks reviewing Stephen's meticulous dossiers, slowly approached the podium for cross-examination. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue with Jordan's tearful narrative. She simply asked him to confirm under the penalty of perjury that he had never threatened me with physical or psychological harm to access my financial assets. Jordan smiled a sad, patient smile and swore he had only ever spoken to me out of deep, abiding love. The prosecutor nodded, turned to the audio-visual technician, and requested that Exhibit 4 be played for the court. The courtroom fell into an absolute suffocating silence. A sharp click echoed from the overhead speakers, followed immediately by the crystal-clear audio recording I had captured on my burner phone during the standoff at the central bank. Jordan's voice, stripped of all its polished corporate charm, roared through the federal courtroom. The recording captured him screaming in vicious, unhinged panic about Audrey's bounced offshore account and his declining credit cards. Then came the devastating, undeniable threat. Jordan's recorded voice dripped with absolute malice as he promised he had a bribed private psychiatrist standing by at my estate. The jury listened in sheer horror as the audio captured him explicitly threatening to send an ambulance, forcefully commit me to an involuntary psychiatric ward, and lock me in a padded room for the rest of my miserable life if I did not release his stolen funds. The stark contrast between the weeping, compassionate son on the witness stand and the ruthless, extortionist predator on the recording was completely paralyzing. The jurors physically recoiled in their seats. Several of them gasped openly, covering their mouths in shock. The sympathy they had felt just moments before instantly morphed into profound, visceral disgust. Jordan froze on the witness stand. The fake tears dried up immediately. He opened his mouth to formulate an objection, to spin another legal loophole, but no words came out. The undeniable objective reality of his own cruelty had trapped him in a cage of his own making. The prosecutor simply stared at him, asking if that sounded like a man setting up a medical trust fund. Jordan looked wildly toward his defense attorney, desperate for an objection to save him from the crushing weight of his own voice. The defense attorney remained seated, his face buried in his hands, knowing the case had just been completely obliterated. The prosecutor did not ask another question. She let the heavy, toxic echo of Jordan's recorded threat hang over the silent courtroom, allowing the jury to fully absorb the true depth of his monstrous greed. I sat in the gallery and watched my son's polished exterior completely shatter. His confident posture collapsed, his shoulders slumping, as the devastating reality of his public exposure set in. Seeing him unravel on that witness stand brought back a vivid, painful memory from 30 years ago. Jordan was 15 years old when I caught him forging his high school report card to hide failing grades. He had used his mother's signature, thinking he was vastly smarter than the working-class parents raising him. When I confronted him with the undeniable proof of his forgery, he had reacted exactly like this. The smug, arrogant entitlement instantly evaporated, replaced by a fragile, frantic terror because he simply could not handle the consequences of his own deception. He had never possessed genuine internal strength. His entire identity was a fragile facade constructed from stolen prestige and unearned arrogance. He could act ruthless behind closed doors, using legal intimidation to bully vulnerable people, but he possessed absolutely zero resilience when dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of public accountability. He was still that same terrified, lying teenager, entirely unable to face the absolute ruin of his carefully manufactured public image. The prosecutor dismissed Jordan from the stand, leaving him to stumble back to the defense table in a state of absolute shock. Before Jordan could even attempt to recover his composure, the prosecution called their final star witness to the stand. The heavy wooden doors opened, and Audrey walked into the courtroom. She had formally accepted a comprehensive plea deal from the federal government, agreeing to provide devastating, unmitigated testimony against her husband in exchange for a significantly reduced prison sentence. Audrey took the oath and immediately began dismantling Jordan's entire life. She detailed his secret second family in Savannah, exposing the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had actively embezzled to fund his illicit double life. She testified that Jordan was the exclusive mastermind behind the Union server cyber attacks and the forged life insurance documents, throwing him completely under the bus to save her own skin. Jordan snapped. The calculated lawyer vanished, replaced by pure, unadulterated rage. He leaped out of his heavy wooden chair, screaming vile curses at his wife, lunging aggressively across the defense table to attack her. 3 armed federal marshals tackled him instantly, wrestling him forcefully to the courtroom floor. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, ordering Jordan to be completely restrained and removed from the room. The jury was immediately dismissed to begin their final deliberations. The grand finale of his corporate empire was nothing but a pathetic, violent tantrum on a federal courtroom floor.
The jury deliberated for a mere 4 hours. When the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom finally opened, a suffocating heavy silence immediately descended upon the gallery. The air felt thick, charged with the inescapable weight of impending justice. Jordan was escorted back into the room by the federal marshals. His wrists were secured in heavy steel handcuffs. The violent outburst that had resulted in his removal earlier had completely drained him. He looked pale, hollow,
and utterly terrified. Audrey sat at the adjoining defense table, refusing to even look in his direction. She clutched her hands tightly in her lap, trembling as the 12 jurors filed back into the box and took their seats. The federal judge struck his gavel, commanding the courtroom to rise. He asked the jury foreman if they had reached a unanimous decision. The foreman, a stern-faced man who looked like he had worked on the freight docks himself, stood up and held a single sheet of paper. He did not hesitate. On the charges of grand larceny, severe elder abuse, wire fraud, and the forgery of official legal documents, the jury found my son Jordan Thompson guilty on all counts. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The foreman continued without pausing. On the charges of active insurance fraud and criminal conspiracy to commit financial exploitation, the jury found Audrey Thompson guilty on all counts. The absolute finality of the verdict echoed off the mahogany walls. The criminal empire my son and daughter-in-law had built on deceit was officially completely demolished. The judge did not waste a single moment. He bypassed the standard sentencing delay, citing Jordan's violent outburst and undeniable flight risk as grounds for immediate judgment. He looked down from the high wooden bench, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. He addressed Jordan directly, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He stated that Jordan had weaponized the sacred trust of the legal profession to ruthlessly prey upon his own father. He declared that Jordan's actions represented the most despicable form of white-collar predation. The judge struck his gavel with a resounding crack and sentenced Jordan to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. The sentence hit Jordan like a physical blow to the chest. His knees buckled. The armed federal marshals had to physically hold him upright by his arms. He looked wildly around the courtroom, his eyes darting toward the exits as if he could somehow negotiate a last-minute loophole. He opened his mouth, but no sophisticated legal arguments came out. Only a pathetic, broken sob escaped his lips. The pristine, arrogant facade he had meticulously maintained for over a decade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He was no longer a high-powered corporate attorney. He was just a convicted felon facing a decade and a half behind cold, unforgiving concrete walls. The judge then turned his piercing gaze toward Audrey. He acknowledged her cooperation in providing evidence against her husband, but firmly rejected her desperate attempt to paint herself as a helpless victim. He reminded the court that she was a willing, eager participant who actively used a dead woman's stolen life insurance policy to fund a life of superficial luxury. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in a federal minimum security facility, ordering the total liquidation of her wellness spa to pay full financial restitution to my estate. Audrey collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands and weeping uncontrollably. 2 female bailiffs approached her table, instructing her to stand and place her hands behind her back. At the same time, the marshals began leading Jordan toward the heavily secured side exit. As they dragged him past the gallery, he turned his head and locked eyes with me one final time. There was no hatred left in his gaze. There was no entitlement or corporate arrogance. There was only absolute crushing despair. He looked exactly like the terrified boy who used to hide behind my legs when a thunderstorm rolled over our small house in the freight yard district. I held his gaze without blinking. I did not offer him a comforting nod or a forgiving smile. I let him see the unyielding strength he had so foolishly underestimated. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate completely. I remained seated in the gallery as the courtroom slowly emptied. A profound, suffocating sorrow washed over my chest. I had spent 40 years breaking my back on the shipping docks, specifically to ensure my son would never know the inside of a jail cell. I wanted him to wear tailored suits and sit in boardrooms, because I believed education and wealth would insulate him from the brutal hardships I had endured. I realize now that the very privileges I broke my body to provide had completely destroyed his moral foundation. I had shielded him from consequence for so long that he fundamentally forgot how to be a decent human being. I had to systematically dismantle my own son's entire life just to save my own basic dignity. It was the hardest, most agonizing decision a father could ever make. Yet as I watched the bailiffs escort him into the dark holding corridor, I knew with absolute chilling certainty that it was a profound necessity. If I had simply surrendered to his abuse, he would have consumed my life, my freedom, and my late wife's legacy like a parasite, and then moved on to destroy his own daughter next. I stood up, adjusted the collar of my faded denim jacket, and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with my head held high. Stephen walked quietly by my side, carrying his heavy encrypted laptop. We pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped out onto the wide concrete steps of the federal courthouse. The bright Atlanta afternoon sun briefly blinded me. A massive swarm of local reporters and camera crews immediately surrounded us, shouting rapid-fire questions about the high-profile verdict. Dozens of microphones were thrust into my face. I did not shrink away from the flashing cameras. I stopped on the top step and looked directly into the news lenses. I stated simply and firmly that absolute justice had been served today and that greed would never override the enduring strength of the working class. I pushed through the sea of reporters and walked toward the street curb. Tiana was standing by the passenger door of my rusty Ford truck. She was waiting for me, entirely separated from the toxic wreckage her parents had left behind. I wrapped my arm protectively around my granddaughter's shoulders. We climbed into the truck, leaving the chaotic media circus and the absolute ruins of Jordan's corporate empire, shrinking in the rearview mirror. We drove away in a peaceful, hard-earned silence. However, my journey was not completely finished. 6 months later, I found myself walking through the sterile, heavily fortified corridors of a maximum security federal penitentiary, preparing for one final necessary confrontation with the man who used to be my son. 6 months passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courtroom slammed shut on my son's life. The brutal Atlanta summer had faded into a crisp, forgiving autumn by the time I finally decided to make the drive upstate. The maximum security federal penitentiary loomed in the distance like a massive concrete fortress surrounded by razor wire and armed guard towers. I parked my old Ford truck in the visitor lot and walked through the sterile, heavily fortified processing center.
I surrendered my belongings, passed through the aggressive metal detectors, and was escorted down a long, echoing corridor, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. A heavy steel door buzzed open, revealing a bleak, windowless visitation room, divided entirely by thick bulletproof plexiglass. I sat down in the cold metal chair bolted to the linoleum floor. I did not have to wait long. A heavy door on the opposite side of the glass opened with a loud mechanical clank.
2 armed corrections officers escorted Jordan into the sterile room. He wore a drab, oversized khaki prison uniform. His wrists were secured in heavy iron chains that rattled loudly in the quiet space. The guards removed his handcuffs and pointed to the metal stool across from me. Jordan sat down heavily. The polished, arrogant corporate lawyer who used to sip expensive champagne in his manicured backyard was completely gone.
The man sitting on the other side of the thick plexiglass looked deeply gaunt, his cheekbones protruding sharply against his pale skin. His perfectly styled hair was buzzing short and aggressively graying at the temples. Jordan picked up the black plastic telephone receiver mounted to the concrete wall. I picked up my receiver and met his hollow, bloodshot eyes. He glared at me with a bitter, exhausted resentment. He leaned closer to the scratched glass and asked if I drove all the way up here just to gloat over his total destruction. He accused me of coming to rub my victory in his face while he rotted in a federal cage. I did not raise my voice or react to his pathetic hostility. I kept my posture perfectly calm. I reached into the breast pocket of my faded denim jacket. I pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill. I pressed the green paper flat against the thick plexiglass directly in his line of sight. I reminded Jordan of the afternoon he marched across his mahogany deck and struck my chest 20 times with dollar bills in front of his wealthy friends.
I reminded him that he proudly announced $20 was the exact price of a one-way bus ticket out of his life. I told him I kept the exact same cash to purchase his ticket to reality. Jordan stared at the $20 bill. His jaw clenched tightly as the profound humiliation of his past arrogance washed over him. I did not stop there. I leaned forward and informed him of the absolute finality of his financial ruin. I told him the massive estate he tried to steal was officially converted into a residential complex managed by the Atlanta Affordable Housing Authority. It currently provides safe, affordable housing for displaced union workers and their families. I watched his eyes widen in pure agony as I explained that Audrey's luxury wellness spa was completely liquidated by the federal courts. Every single asset she purchased with my late wife's stolen life insurance policy was seized and auctioned off to pay restitution. I told him that the recovered offshore funds were heavily secured in an ironclad college trust fund.
That money now belongs exclusively to his daughter Tiana, and it is legally structured so that neither he nor Audrey can ever touch a single dime of her future. Jordan realized in that exact moment that his entire legacy was absolutely erased. And had sacrificed his freedom, his marriage, and his career to secure a fortune that was now actively serving the very working-class people he vehemently despised.
I looked at the broken man on the other side of the glass, feeling a profound, heavy sorrow mixed with undeniable peace. My ultimate victory was never about malicious revenge. It was entirely about the strict restoration of order. I had spent 40 grueling years breaking my back in the sweltering freight yards to build a foundation of security for my family. I sweated and bled for every dollar to ensure my loved ones would never know the crushing weight of poverty.
When Jordan weaponized that hard-earned wealth to abuse me and exploit innocent people, he fundamentally corrupted the sacrifices of my entire lifetime. I could not allow the wealth I built with my own hands to become an instrument of elite cruelty. I had to rip his fraudulent empire down to the studs to ensure those resources finally served the people who actually deserved them. I corrected the toxic lineage he tried to establish. I protected my granddaughter from his infectious greed and honored my late wife's memory by transforming our stolen assets into a shield for the vulnerable. I had finally cured the sickness that infected my family. Jordan stared blankly at the crumpled $20 bill pressed against the plexiglass. The catastrophic weight of his colossal arrogance finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his ego. He slowly lowered his head, completely unable to maintain eye contact with me. A single pathetic sob escaped his lips and echoed through the plastic receiver. He finally understood that his ruthless ambition had bought him absolutely nothing but a 15-year sentence in a concrete box.
I did not offer him a comforting word or a promise of future forgiveness. I pulled the $20 bill away from the glass and placed it back into my pocket. I hung the heavy black receiver back onto the wall hook. I stood up from the metal chair, turned my back on my weeping son, and walked out of the visitation room without looking back a single time. I walked out of the massive federal penitentiary and stepped into the bright, unclouded Atlanta sunlight. The air felt incredibly fresh.
I climbed into my rusty Ford truck and drove back to the city. I did not go to a luxury restaurant or a high society gala. I drove straight to the Yvonne Thompson Community Center. I unlocked the front doors and walked into the quiet, sunlit main hall. I picked up a simple push broom from the utility closet. I began to sweep the polished hardwood floors I had built with my own hands. The rhythmic sweeping motion brought me absolute serenity. I had lost the illusion of the son I wanted,
but I had reclaimed the life I truly loved. I found absolute immeasurable wealth in my quiet, unbroken dignity.
Thank you for listening to my story today. Let me know what you would have done in my situation by leaving a comment below. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about